Good morning, folks, and welcome to the Water Topics State Water Commission joint meeting here in Fargo. Certainly appreciate the attendance of the State Water Commission members and the Governor and Lieutenant Governor. And first of all, I'd also like to thank Rocky Schneider and Jason and Nathan for the tour yesterday. It was very well done. Appreciate that. We saw a lot, and thank you very kindly for that. So with that, let's go into the roll call, if we will, please, Claire.
Chairman Schmidt,
Here.
Representatives Anderson, Bowe,
Here.
Daniel,
Here.
Powell,
Here.
Martinson, Mitchcott, here, Nelson, Sanford,
Here.
Striley,
Here.
Zipke, here, Senators Lee,
Present.
Casper,
Here.
Truen, coming, Robinson,
Aye.
Shively,
Here.
Zorbach,
Here.
Governor Burgum,
Here.
Lieutenant Governor Sanford,
Here.
Commissioners Gehring, Zimmerman, Owen,
Here.
McDonald, Johnson,
Here.
Anderson, here, Peterson,
Here.
and Anderson. Okay,
Representative Nelson should be here briefly.
okay.
All right, thank you. Consideration of the minutes for the Legislative Water Topics Committee as of August 13 to 14.
Move approval.
Senator Robinson moves approval. Seconded. Senator Sorvog, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. Okay, let's go right into the governor's comments, sir. Floor is yours.
Morning, Chairman. Let me just open by sharing my gratitude with you and the rest of the Water Topics Committee for holding this meeting in this part of the state. And thanks for everybody that came yesterday to learn more about the important infrastructure projects going on in this area, both in the city of Fargo and in Cass County. Want to thank the Water Commission staff that Brent Sanford and I have an opportunity to work with regularly. Want to thank the water commissioners that are working so hard in their relatively new positions. Thank you for traveling from across state. Also want to thank the City of Fargo staff and all the visitors that are here today too for participating in this public meeting because obviously these are topics today are of deep importance to us. From the Water Commission standpoint, we certainly appreciate the opportunity to continue to collaborate with the legislature as we develop a strategy on how to solve the many water infrastructure challenges facing our state from east to west. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so on behalf of Lieutenant Governor Brent Sanford and myself, we appreciate being here at the table with all of you.
Hey, thank you, sir. A couple of comments, if I may. We're being broadcast live. That's the first comment. The second comment is that
You could have told me that before I spoke.
No, we're trying to catch you. The second thing is that your microphones are hot. So that is not the way we run the legislative committee meetings. So that's going to be a little different for us. Another point is that this is our sine die committee meeting. So we'll be ending with sine die, so this will be the last one. And we do have an agenda change. Instead of Ken Royce at 8:20, Dwayne DeCray is going to make that presentation. Then at 9:15, instead of Mr. Grinberg, we're going to have Miss Delray Williams will speak at 9:15, and then Mr. Grinberg will speak at 9:50. And those are the only agenda changes that I have right now. With that, I mentioned that let's stay on schedule. We've got, we want to end at 2:30, so let's keep our time frames, and I ask our speakers to stay within your time frame. And if we do have some good discussion, we'll have to take that up with someplace else. And if you'll notice, I do not have the state engineers making a presentation because it was always easy to get rid of him if we had to. And so we don't have anybody we can do that with this time, so let us stay on the agenda. And with that, Mr. DeCray, you've got from 8:20 to 8:45, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. 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 Thank you
Thank you. Good morning, Governor Burgum and the members of the State Water Commission, Representative Schmidt, and members of the Interim Water Topics Committee. Glad to be with you here this morning again to give one of our quarterly updates on the Red River Valley Water Project. I want to thank Mayor Mahoney for joining me this morning. He is the chairman of the Lake Agassiz Water Authority and is definitely a full partner with Garrison in engineering, design, and construction of the Red River Valley Water Supply Project. So between the two of us, we're going to give you an update this morning on where the project's at and where we think we're headed. We're going to talk about the need, of course. We always bring that up. And we're going to talk about an issue that we've been working on for the last year and some of the recent successes and recent progresses that we've made. And then we're going to give you an update on where we're at with the last water bill, House Bill 1020, that the legislature passed last session. And then the mayor will finish it up by talking about the financial plan.
First of all, I want to welcome you to Fargo. A little housekeeping. If you parked on the street, we'll give you a ticket, but it won't cost you anything. If you come back a second time, it'll cost you. So that way I can get you out of it. Otherwise, we got the governor here. Maybe he can sign something for us, but that's the way we do it. We'd hope to have our new city hall ready for you. It's not quite ready. Things take a little more time. So we have more people in this room. It feels fuller, and we may have some rabble-rousing in the crowd. But typically when we have this is when we're talking about taxes or some different changes in the city. When we talk about the Red River Valley water supply, we are very aware a drought is an ever-present threat to us. And many of you know in this room, and we're impacted by the flood or the drought that we had in the western part of the state. But in a matter of 6 months, you can see a change in the state as far as water and needs of water within our state. We know that we'll have another drought coming forward at some time, and if we have an economic impact, it should be over 25 million that would have on us in this community. We have a variety of industrial needs throughout the state, and oftentimes the water demand exceeds our current supply. Many of our industries around here, ethanol plant uses wastewater, so we've creatively fought a way of using water without using our processed water, and that allows for many of the industrial areas to grow. City of Fargo has a $110 million water plant that we set up as a regional plant for this community. West Fargo, Horace, and other communities are part of that. And we also, in our wastewater, which is a $120 million plant, we also take care of the wastewater in the region and anticipate being a regional leader in that. The present plan for the Red River Valley Water Project serves 35 cities and water systems in the developmental phase. We have looked at multiple different options as to the alignment of the project, and this is the final one that we've come to. You will see a little dotted line of the McCluskey Canal as an alternative moving forward, and we do have a FONSI for 20 cubic feet of water to do that at this time. We also looked at Upper Cheyenne consideration, which was what considered with Devil's Lake. It looked at a different option and different ways of doing the project. We have come back to doing a pipeline extension and Upper Cheyenne River discharge extensions that are in the eastern part of the state that we think we can modify the plan and serve more people. We would like to have the Upper Cheyenne discharge extension as an option in the future at some time, as there's immense need in Devil's Lake Basin, that we would have the ability to put that on as an extension, and on the project have a pipe that would extend towards that area. So present problem that we have now with coordination moving forward is present the problem and ideas to address, request an inclusion of the Red River Valley water supply, and Mayor Dick Johnson is going to present to the LAWA board and just talk about the needs of the Devil's Lake Basin as well. One of the things we have to remember in the water supply issues, we serve nearly half the North Dakota's population as we go through that. We've been attempting to do prudent spending, strategic construction, and a solid financial plan. And as you all know, we have to get into construction or we have some federal impacts that might come in and slow down the construction. So recent progress, I think you're going to take that over, Dwayne?
Some of the recent successes and progress that we've had in the project is that this month we were issued a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact by the Bureau of Reclamation for 20 CFS out of the canal. And so the next step, it'll be about a year or more that we will be entering into negotiations for a water service contract with the Bureau to find out what they have to charge for the water, to make their repayment plan and everything on the Garrison Diversion Unit. We have received our jurisdictional wetland determinations from the Corps of Engineers. That was a 2+ year process, and so that was always in the back of our mind at this late date of changing the route of the pipeline, that would definitely set us back about 2 years if we changed the route. And the intake, the permit applications that we have submitted to date are the intake permit from the Corps of Engineers out of the Missouri River, south of Washburn, a discharge permit from the North Dakota State Health Department. They are waiting for some information from us, and as soon as we get that to them, they will be able to continue on with their process. And then we've also applied for a sovereign lands permit, which we need from the State Water Commission. One of the criteria that the state engineer and state water commission asked us to do during the last legislative session was to do a value engineering study on the project. And so recently we put out an RFP and had a couple firms bid, and we picked HDR, and they spent a week in Fargo here going over the project with a fine-tooth comb to see if they could find any areas that we could improve or savings that we might enjoy. They gave us their out brief, and they're going to give us a draft written report by the 30th. And the bottom line of the VE was that there's probably about $25 to $30 million of savings that we can realize if we use some of the suggestions that came out of the value engineering study. Back to the law that you passed last session, I just want to mention section by section where we're at it, because we need to check all these criteria before we get the $13 million construction funds authorized by the legislature. Garland has to certify that. We have to take it to the State Water Commission, and then it comes back to the legislature. You probably will be in session when all these check marks have been made, and so you may want to change the process, but that's definitely always up to the legislature on how they want to handle it. So we looked at the different alternative selections for water supply. That's been completed on the Missouri River system from Missouri to the Cheyenne River. We have 165 CFS of water identified that we can supply, so we have our water supply. We have worked diligently on coming up on what the total project cost for the project is going to be. It's going to be about $1.141 billion, and that's in $17. And the caveat to that is that for every year that this project is delayed, would tax on about another $28 million. So there is some urgency in trying to get this to construction. We are going to start with easement acquisitions. At present time, we've been kind of held up for about a year since January because we were studying the Upper Cheyenne issue, and there wasn't any reason. We got heard loud and clear from the legislature that they didn't want us to spend money that was not going to become fruitful in the end. And so now that the route is settled, we can go into easement acquisitions, and we'll be starting that very soon. The environmental regulation compliance, which is basically, you told us we had to meet the Boundary Waters Treaty Act. That's in progress. We're working with the North Dakota State Health Department on the discharge permit, and so that's in progress. The implementation schedule, we think we have a good schedule that we can follow and continue on, which will be determined in the end by the legislature, which plan you choose or which plan you come up with for on what kind of a strict construction schedule and the length that you want to do that. We've already talked about the permits we've applied for. We do have completed the intake on the Missouri River and the permit on and FONSI for the McCluskey, so we've completed the secure water source. We prioritized our construction features on what we think should be the first step in construction. We'll talk about that in a bit. We've given some funding. We did put a financial plan together. We took out, and we did demonstrate to some legislators. So when you go into session and you start talking about what the cost share for the users are going to be and what the financing package and that will be, we've got the model in place that you can plug those figures into during the session to see what the end result will be for the users. So that's completed. We continue to talk to legislators about the funding options in the Bank of North Dakota, and we haven't started on the construction approval yet because we have not checked all the boxes. We expect to have all those boxes checked sometime in the January-February timeframe while you are in session. And of course, we give our quarterly progress reports to you, and we will continue to update you as you ask. This is a graphic that shows our spend. If you look at the solid blue, that tells the 12.9 million that you gave us last biennium and how that was spent. The solid orange is this biennium, and then the hashed orange is the projected spend. We believe we are on track to spend the $30 million that you appropriated to us. The caveat with that is that the funds will be obligated by June of this coming year, but construction will probably go into fall on the strategic construction. So the funds will be obligated within the biennium that they were appropriated for, but construction may drag on a little longer than that. So we think our prudent spending is on track. This is just kind of a list of the things that we've accomplished. In June of 16, we completed the conceptual design report. In 18, we've completed the preliminary design report. We just finished up the value engineering. We have started final design of the key components of the 28-mile pipeline segment. The 28-mile pipeline segment has been chosen because that is the pipeline that would feed the Jamestown area that has the least amount of risk of ever becoming a stranded asset. And so that is why that 28 miles has been chosen. We are engineering on the Cheyenne discharge structure and the Missouri River intake. Analyzing the financial scenarios, a handful of legislative leadership got to do that in Jamestown earlier this summer, and we will start very soon now with the right-of-way acquisition and the preferred financial plan. What we recommend to the legislature, of course, will be whatever you decide in your deliberations what that should look like. Turn it over to the mayor.
We realize the difficulty with the project is that the Red River Valley water supply is not replacing existing facilities. The water will come over and have to be retreated. We do have infrastructure that's continually used and maintained by current users. The question I think you all have to ask is on our utility bill, how much will the public tolerate? $5 a month, $10 a month if we're going to do it for supplemental water. So in talking to Chairman Schmidt, it's a little bit different than trying to do a 50-50 match on some of our projects. We believe this will probably be a little bit different. When we look at the cost, what we ask the users to do is what can you afford? Let's figure out what we can afford, because we'd rather not come out with a plan and then the users say, hey, we can't afford that, so then the project doesn't go forward. And that's more, I think you all have to ask that question, is how much will we put in our utility bills and how much will the public tolerate? We anticipate in the city of Fargo we will have to go back to a sales tax that's supposed to expire in 2028 and revote that for another 20-year extension. And that's probably where we'll put our area to take the supplemental water, because I can talk to the public, and a quarter cent is worth $6 million, which really helps us. What we're asking in the financial analysis by the legislative team is what would work best for people when you're doing supplemental water, and I think that's our challenge. We do have major users at up to 90% of the capacity, and we have smaller users as well. We're trying to merge the data for both types of users to see what the status ability to pay analysis. So we're actually working with many cities and trying to figure out what we your community tolerate as far as money to supplement and be a local share. The big dilemma we have in Fargo is we have significant infrastructure projects, and you're all well aware of the flood diversion. A lot of our money and capital is tied up in that project. And Fargo right now supplies water and wastewater. West Fargo and Casper Water District also is a significant part of that. In talking to Mayor Bernie Dardis, he's a little concerned that if we start tacking on their utility bill to pay for supplemental water, he's just a little bit concerned about that. So we think there has to be a balance between the flood diversion and the Red River Valley water supply, and when the construction and when the money goes to the two projects. As we see it, if a permit comes forth in December, we would want to move as fast as we could with the diversion. And I've been talking to different members of this committee, and one of the things is get it done. If we get it done, theoretically, the diversion could be built over 6 years. And so that's something that we probably would want to maximally fund. And then we can go to the Red River Valley supply. How much can we do to continue the progress in construction, but maybe not go full blast? So we're completing a user ability to pay analysis. We're going to coordinate the asks for the legislative body between the diversion and the Red River Valley water supply. We're going to work with the Bank of North Dakota and North Dakota water reps to share, to have a state share through Resources Trust Fund and local map options. Coordinating project asks to be ready prior to legislative session, so we hope by December we will have that for you. The things that you've asked of us is a faster schedule, which is a 10-year schedule, significantly reduces the cost and risk. And again, talking to Chairman Schmidt, he asked if we could do it in 7 years. So the value of money, of course, is one of the biggest issues we have with this project. Efficient financing would be a long-term, low-interest loan, and is the state in concurrence that we want to do a 10-year construction strategy. As we all know, the longer the project takes, the more expensive it is as far as interest. So striking the right cost share to ensure affordability is also important so the local areas can get that up there. And again, that's a discussion we think we need to have with you as partners and figure out what works best for everybody. So to go forward,
So as we plan on going forward to keep the project moving, we are going to start up with the acquisitions of the easements right now. We've been holding up on that since January. That's put us a little bit behind schedule, but we think we can catch up. We will be continuing to focus on meeting all the boxes that need to be checked for House Bill 1020, get that to the State Water Commission as soon as possible. And we'll keep working on our permitting, and we can't emphasize enough that we need to start strategic construction under the Trump administration. I was at a conference recently, and the EPA, an official from the EPA said they plan on rolling out the replacement WOTUS rule this fall. So we'll have a chance to look at it if they actually get that done. But we think that we need to get under construction to get substantial reliance on those permits so that if something does happen on the federal government level, that we will still be good to keep the project going because we'll be grandfathered in. And we don't know how long the Trump administration is going to last, and so we need to kind of hedge our bets, I think.
Representative Straley has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can answer that, 6 years. So what's the, so with that being said, you know, the rush to get this going, why are we having this discharge or whatever? That's never been talked about in any legislative committee that I've ever been in. So why are we changing this project again, which looks to me like it's going to delay it, which is not what we want.
The issue of the changing of the pipeline to the Upper Cheyenne discharge came about during the State Water Commission meeting, and the mayor of Devil's Lake brought it up that his engineer had been looking at it and thought that there was possibly some cost savings that could be made if we would shorten up the pipe and make it bigger and turn it north into the earlier reaches of the Cheyenne River. We did a kind of what I would call a white paper on that, where we went through all the many studies that have been done before and the value engineering that was done that was used to come to the conclusion on what the route should be. And that was deemed not to be acceptable. It was too cursory, so then we actually did a full-blown study and hired engineers, and we went through the process. Basically what the process showed us was that, yes, there is a $200 million cost savings right up front on capital costs. However, when you put it through the life cycle cost analysis that the legislature wants all projects to go through at this point, it turns out to be $20 million more in the long run. And so there wasn't any cost savings there. It also would negate the use of the canal. We could lose the 20 CFS Fonzie that we have right now. And the other thing is that we've always had in our back pocket the collector well system south of Washburn. And if we do get tied up and one of our opponents would be able to federalize the project, there would not be enough water in the collector well system to fill that increased size pipe. And so that is where we landed back on the route that we were on.
So that's a dead issue then? I mean, seems to me it should be, if that's what you're saying. And then on the funding side, if you had all the funds, which we've got this great little investment fund that has billions in it that would work real well, called the Legacy Fund to borrow from, how quickly could you build this? If you had all the local and state funds?
I think I'd 6 years.
Thank you.
Please continue. Is there any other questions for Mr. DeCray? Seeing none, thank you, sir. Oh, excuse me, Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dwayne, you did mention that, or maybe the mayor mentioned the ability to identify a cost of the water during the next legislative session. Do you have that information today? And if you do,
That's in progress. We're doing affordability studies for, as the mayor showed in his slide, for 90% of the water is the systems that were listed on the top of that slide. And that, I don't know if that's been completed or not, but it's in progress. And then we've got the smaller users, like you got a Tuttle in there that's at, 0.1 cubic feet per second. So that they're trying to identify the cost of the water, and, what makes it complicated is we don't know what the legislature is going to do. I mean, we don't know what the cost share is going to be. We don't know what the financing is going to be if we go through the Bank of North Dakota, or if a bill comes in to use the legacy fund. That all has an effect on what the water is going to cost. And there's so many unknowns at this time, it would be pretty hard to say it's going to be so much 1,000.
well, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ducray, that's one of my concerns with this project from the onset, is that normally, in a normal water project, your customer base is identified first, and then a cost is derived from that base. And to go to communities and ask them what they can afford, I know what the answer is going to be. As little as they can possibly get away with is the answer.
I understand
And
that.
who ends up being left on the hook in this is is quite honestly the legislature in the state of North Dakota. And the Water Commission has policy in water supply that 75% grant funding is the max. I'd question whether that would be sufficient in this case, and but there's a lot of other water projects in the state that are important to the state's needs as well, and we have to balance all that ultimately.
Now, we understand that. We think we've got a handle on the volume of water that's needed. We talked to the 35 cities that signed up for it in the rural water systems. I see my engineer standing behind here. Maybe he's got a better answer, but we're aware of that. But I was going to say, Representative Nelson, in 20 years that I was in the legislature on occasion more than once told the locals what they could afford.
Representative Mitskog has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure who can best address this question, but I'm looking at the in-progress negotiations with the potential users. So how important or vital is it for this a go with this project if, the participation, if you lose some users' participation? Can you comment on?
Our discussions with legislative leadership has been along the lines that we realistically think that there probably will be some systems that drop out once the costs become better known. And the legislature has said to this point that was going to be their excess water in the pipe that would be for the states to sell to users that came along as they saw fit.
And another question, this is probably more best suited for Mayor Mahoney. Your comments earlier regarding two projects for Fargo, the flood project and this project, the water supply project. So flood first and then this second, or, if there's further delays in the flood project, where does this project sit?
Oh, we would anticipate right now a possible permit from Minnesota end of December, and then we would anticipate starting next year we'd go full bore on the diversion. Exactly to your comment is the diversion project is over $2.2 billion. It's a bigger project, bigger cost, and any migration or delay in that project continues to add cost to the project. So our sense of that is if we could get that done first would probably be the best way to do that. But yet at the same time, if we don't start some construction on Red River Valley water supply, we can't get under the nexus, we can't get under the environmental concerns. Federal would come back in there and it could stop the project. So we at least have to have some construction funds in the Red River Valley supply. The intent by the legislative body was $150 million per biennium for the Red River Valley water supply. We're saying we may need to cut that significantly down so that when we come and ask for what we would need to complete the diversion, our more focus would be on that at this time. The build for the diversion is 6 years, so that's going to be our most intense capital need.
If I could continue. So with regard to Representative Striley's comments about fast-tracking this project and possibly using a big savings account the state has, so I guess if I'm hearing this right, so the priority for Fargo is flood the diversion first, and then this is a secondary? I mean, I guess I'm grappling with the other users that are now kind of potentially, that haven't completely signed on. I mean, to have them hanging on with the unknown of the diversion, if that's going to be the priority, I guess I'm not clear with the intentions of trying to move this project, and fast-track it.
Well, at one time, the Red River Valley Water Supply was going to be a 17-year project, and I think that was a long time to build it. So the question is, again, it'll be what the state has money. I mean, we hear some concerns about what the revenue will be, what's going to come back, what you actually have capacity to spend. So we would work with your team and try to figure out what makes most sense. But the reality to us, like a $500 million bond from somewhere drops cost over $150 million in interest. So there is some advantages to bonding of money, and there's advantages to doing some things a different way. So we would look to your leadership at what you think we need to do, the best option to finance. To me, it's like buying a car. You put so much down and you buy so much to get the monthly payments at a certain rate, and that's what we're attempting to do. Sales taxes in Fargo have dropped. There was anticipation that would be 3% a year. That's dropped the last 2 years. We're starting to see some recovery of that. If sales tax grows at 1.5% or 2%, that really makes the financial picture look much different, and then the locals will be contributing more in a sense than the state will. So we're just trying to intricacies by December. We think we'll have a pretty solid idea of the financial plan. Tony Grinberg will speak to that on the diversion part, but we're, as you all are too, is what's the oil income, what's coming in sales tax, what's happening. You have so many moving parts. I think the governor's comment one time, when we do long-term financing, how do we do it when we have so many financial moving parts? So in some sense, we may have more money come in and we will ask less from the state. But I think we're going to get a pretty good idea what the diversion is going to cost, what the Red River Valley is going to cost, and how should we do that. And I would look for help for your team to help me figure out which one. But would anticipate, if you ask me as mayor of Fargo, I need to protect 235,000 people. So a diversion would be my strongest ask right now. And the Red River Valley Supply, hope for no drought for 10 years. But, I mean, that's going to be really the hope that we don't get caught.
Okay, thank you. Representative Howe, and then Senator Sorbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Dwayne can maybe answer this question as far as the pre-construction requirements, as far as environmental regulation compliance. How are the talks with the health department in Manitoba proceeding? Do you see any holdups, especially before we go into session in January?
We think we're on track with the state health department. There's a couple organisms that are different. Well, there's more than a couple organisms that are different between the Missouri River Basin and the Red River Basin, but we've identified a couple that wouldn't be killed with the treatment processes that we've proposed so far. And so that's what we're working on right now, is that how would we handle those 2 additional organisms. And we haven't gotten our information back to the state health department yet because we don't know it yet. That's one of the things that we're working aggressively on right now is finding people that are specialists in that area, and so that we can have a protected system that we can understand that we could go to court for and win in court if somebody challenged our treatment.
May I continue?
Yes.
Are you optimistic things will be going smoothly, or are this going to be another court battle that we'll have to face? And again,
Well, my answer today is different than it would have been at the first part of the week. We met with the Red River Basin Commission Water Supply Subcommittee, Chairman Veen, the Vice Chair Lawa, and myself, and Garland, and we felt, the 3 of us came to the same conclusion after the meeting, after we were talking about it, is that we thought that the Canadian stance had softened. Before, whenever we talked about treatment, it was always about, well, there might be something unknown in 10 years, and we want you to treat for that, too. And on Monday, they actually handed us a sheet that had the class of organisms that needed to be treated, and they said, this is what we think needs to be satisfied, and if we can get there, we will be happy with the treatment scheme. Now, those are individuals from Manitoba. We are going up in December to look at a water treatment plant in Winnipeg that has a water feed pipeline about the same size as what the Red River would be, and so we're going to go up and take a look at that in November, I think it is. And so Ted Preisters, who's here, who's head of the Red River Basin Commission, the executive director, has been putting those meetings together. And at first, we kind of stared at each other and told us, where we didn't think this was going to go anywhere. But I think Monday there was a different tone in the room, and we're hopeful that that is a sign that, maybe their loss on the NAS project has kind of brought them around to reality. And we're working on another subject. We're working on putting together a management program for the treatment of NAS, and so we think maybe that's an adaptive management plan, and maybe that's the way they're going to want to go on the Red River project too. So we're hopeful.
The other issue is the governor does have a relationship with the Manitoba Premier, so we feel that in some ways he may be able to help us in this issue.
Yeah, I spoke with the Premier about 2.5 weeks ago, and this one's a little different because when Red River Valley was out of water in the 1930s, so was Winnipeg. And this is something that would have some benefit to them, have more water flowing through the system during an extreme extended drought, and so I think there's an opportunity to collaborate. He's indicated a willingness to do some home and away meetings where we go up there, he comes down here, he brings the team, and having now met 3 times with Brian Palliser, he grew up just across the border. He's like a North Dakota farm kid from the west side of the Red River Valley that played a lot of fast-pitch softball in Fargo. So he understands. I mean, he can drive to Fargo and find his way around, find every softball field in town. So I mean, it's not like he's a stranger to North Dakota. And so we've got someone here that we can really, I think, work with to try to resolve some of these issues in a common sense way.
Probably the biggest supporter we've got in Canada to the point is the Pembina Valley Water Co-op that's right across the border. They've always supported the Red River project because, they're right north of us and they get their water out of the Red, and so they know they're going to be short. And so they've always tried to get Canada to get on board with the project, and I think maybe now they're having more success than they had in the past.
Senator Sorvog.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to back up. This question is for Dwayne to Representative Migsuggs, one of her earlier. But on people dropping out once they know the funding, and I know I'm not asking you to name names, and you don't know what the funding exactly is going to be. But when you're saying you anticipate a few might, you're talking about more of the smaller entities that were brought in. I mean, this has been worked on for a couple of years, bringing as many people. We're talking water to half the state.
You basically have 2 sets of people that have signed up for water. You got those that have an absolute water need, like Fargo and Grand Forks. They know they don't have enough domestic water. And then you've got users that would like to maybe have some industrial possibilities in their town, and so they maybe are kind of betting on the come that if they've got enough water, they can maybe get some kind of a processing facility or something. And so when you do your budget, the first thing that goes, if you're short of money, is the want, I mean, the needs are what you have to fund. And so there might be some of the localities that are in that position when they find out what the cost is going to be. We haven't heard of anybody. I mean, nobody has come to us and said, you know what, we're out. We don't care what it costs. Everybody's in that wait and see mode. Tell us what it's going to cost, and then we'll give you a decision on whether we're staying or not.
Mr. Chairman, if I might follow up. But your feeling is the big players, the big amounts to make this economically viable are on board if we can come up with a reasonable number.
Big players are in.
That's critical. They're on board everything else.
So we've looked at the cost ratio 65, 35, 75, 25, 90, 10, 90, 95, 5, and trying to sort out what those numbers would be. But again, it goes to that question, how much will you tolerate for drought prevention in your utility bill if we do it to users and go $5 a month, $6 a month, $10 a month? how much will the public tolerate? So when you sometimes ask local match, this is a very personal thing to our consumers, so that's what we're trying to figure out. Because when we look at the 65-35, Fargo can't afford it. It's too much money. We have to try to figure out some magic middle that works for both sides, the state and then the locals.
Commissioner Johnson.
Maybe for Dwayne. We had a subcommittee meeting last week, Water Commission subcommittee meeting. At that, we looked at some projects that are coming down the road, I think in October. But one of those was a request from the Northeast Water District, where they want to do, and they're going to solicit funds to have a new study done, or a study done, to see if there's another alternative to get water to those users up in that northeast section. And I think there was like 15 possible entities that they're going to study, and see if there's a cheaper alternative, or if, I guess if it's feasible for them. Or a different source, to look for a different source. So how would that affect the project? Is there some bigger users up there?
They came and talked to us before they initiated that, and we were in full support with them. We see no reason that we should try to get people to buy more expensive water than they have to. And so that's an ongoing study, and I think they're on the very front end of that study. And so we'll see where that goes. But yeah, we're in full support of the Northeast coming up with whatever options they can for water supply.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you, gentlemen. And Mayor Mahoney, the podium is yours, sir.
Well, thank you. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about the FM diversion. Rocky, get the slides up. I want to thank all the people in this room that have helped us work on the diversion, and I also want to thank state engineers that have worked us as well with this project. I think sometimes we focus so much on the DNR, we forget that our state did a great job and is very helpful to us on the diversion. So really would like to do that. And I also like to thank our Corps partners that have been with us for 10 years trying to figure this thing out. So we began working on this 10 years ago, City of Fargo, City of Moorhead, and the Corps 208. And we had the 209 flood, and then we really started working on it. Progress has been made, and we continue to make progress on the project, and hope to have a complete and a permit from Minnesota at the end of 2018. It would not be possible without strong and early support from the state, and it allowed us to better navigate the federal approval system. So to date, $450 million has been spent enhancing flood protection in Fargo and Cass County. For those of you who did the tour yesterday, you saw a lot of that work that has gone on throughout the community, permanent levees and flood walls. Those have been at a cost of $215 million. Fargo and Cass County combined have 416 properties that have been acquired since 2009. Land acquisition is being ready for construction. The federal process also has made significant purchases. Throughout the city of Oxbow was part of our first project in a sense, and the flood protection through the city of Oxbow has been built to mitigate for project impacts. They are protected to 500-year event. Over 50 homes upstream have been acquired preemptively to mitigate against operations of the diversion project. Kindred School District has been discussed it many times throughout the project. Since we announced to the public there was some concern that their tax revenue would go down and their enrollment would go down. Actually, we've seen an increase in enrollment from 665 students to 758, with the tax rate increasing from approximately 15.4 million to 23.0 million. Tax base increases were led by the City of Oxbow property valuation, an increase of 38% in 2016 and another 58% in 2017. And I think one of the criticisms of the project is the valuation of the Oxbow homes was much lower than it should be. They now are within market. So Plan B, which has finally come out as an option for the project, is 100-year flood protection as a minimum. We can protect up to 500 years. There's a variety of different control structures you can see on the southern embankment that go up along the valley. When you get to the intake valve just at the corner, then P3 project goes from that up north as well. So there's a diversion channel, the southern embankment with control structures. We have temporary staging of floodwaters upstream to prevent downstream impacts, and we have in-town levees. This is a 100-year floodplain shown in blue. With the project, this is the area that is protected. It gives us the ability to defend a 500-year flood event. We would require 18 to 20 miles of temporary clay and sandbags. So a lot of times when you go through our community, you say, Tim, why don't you just tuck it all up? If you tuck it all up, you sometimes will take out affordable housing. So to tuck it all up in some ways and make your drains wider, put your dikes up, you would take out homes. And we felt from going to I-94, or 29, excuse me, west, that would be significant impact to our community, and our affordable housing would be impacted. Moorhead says some of the same issues of how do you protect some of your low-income or lower-cost housing without disrupting them. So our stance is that we have protection for a 100-year flood, and if we had a 500-year event, we would be able to defend with that, but we'd have to do some emergency measures. Why did the project change? Richland Wilkin County JPA filed a lawsuit against Corps of Engineers in 2013. The lawsuit was joined by Fargo-Moorhead Diversion Authority in the state of Minnesota. A majority of the claims were dismissed and injunctions stopped construction September 2017. And Thunheim basically said you got to find common ground and figure it out. So Governors Dayton and Burgum, who we're very thankful to, got together and co-chaired a 16-person task force, and they did develop design principles and concept-level engineering solutions for the flood risk mitigation. We have taken the task force consensus, and those task force consensus then identified what the project should at least have. It did increase the amount of water that goes through the city of Fargo. At the time we first did the project, it was 30 feet water. Then it went to 35. Now it's gone to 37. And sometimes it doesn't seem like that when you go through 2 feet. What does 2 feet mean? Well, it does impact more people, more homes, and we have to take out 26 more homes. There's things we have to do whenever you go up a little bit higher. The western tieback levee alignment is North Dakota, eastern tieback alignment Minnesota. It changes the impact 80-20, so 80% of the impact's in North Dakota, 20% is in Minnesota. Distributed storage is valuable in long-term risk management, but at the point of the project, we need something to handle things that come in as an emergency and in the springtime. So we want to thank everybody on that task force because we feel that task force did a woman's job in getting things moving forward, identified what the issues were, and got us to work on some solutions, gave us some guidance in doing that, and they had very strong commitment by both governors to sit at 5-hour meetings and go through those. So, did Delray? Yep. Delray is a little caught off guard because we changed the schedule, but she's here today. Delray is the chair of the FM Diversion Board at this time. I'm past chair. I want to thank her for all her hard work. With her leadership and guidance, we've been able to get through Minnesota. We feel we have a solid partnership with the Corps, with the DNR, and with the team to get through this, and everybody's trying to find a way to get to the solution. So I'll let her talk to us a little bit about permitting review, and we're going to have different speakers today just to give you somebody besides me, but other experts in this area. Thank you.
Welcome to our community. What it doesn't say in there is I'm the mayor of Moorhead, Minnesota, so I'm on the other side of the river. I've been hearing about what you've been doing, and I really appreciate the work that you've been doing in this area, and so thank you for that. Is this a clicker? Oh, gotcha. Moorhead, I came on in 2014. Moorhead was a little bit surprised by the flood in 2009. We're about 3-4 feet higher than the Fargo side is. So we were not doing anything regarding to that except for coming over and helping our neighbor when it came to flood time. But in the meantime, we have acquired more than 250 homes. We built 12 miles of levees and flood walls, and spent a good $105 million on that, most of that from the state of Minnesota. And besides that, Oakport, which used to be a separate entity but is now part of Moorhead, the watershed district worked on what would be the east end of that area, not by the river, but the east end, and spent $35 million. We are currently got some funding that we hope to be using soon to do the river side of that Moorhead, but we'll know more about that in the next week or two. So future projects related to our town will need about 68 more home acquisitions. All those homes know that they're part of it. They were part of it when we talked about Plan A, and they'll be part of it for this. And we figure that will cost us about another $40 million, most of which we figure we'll get from the state of Minnesota. They've been a very good partner for us. Currently, where it is the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources completed their supplemental EIS. They're at the portion of time where they're asking for public comment. The public comment portion ends on the 27th, so very soon. And then they will look at which things that they may or may not need to do more work on. During this time frame, we looked at 33 alternatives. As Governor Burgum knows, we did a ton of those. Extra besides that, when the two governors convened a group of 16, I was fortunate to be a part of that. It was a very good conversation to have by all the people that are concerned with this. And we're not totally sure, but we've got indications that it may be November, December that we'll hear. And frankly, I'm feeling pretty positive about it. So we made the new application. They're reviewing it currently. And then they said it would be sometime this winter. We've seen some degree of timeframes. We know that they would like to have it done before Governor Dayton is out of office. He's, I think he changes somewhere early January. So I think there'll be a push to have that done in a timely way. In addition to the 130 that we've gotten from the state of Minnesota, we have been requesting additional funds. On the Diversion Authority, there is, besides myself, there's 2 of my city council members, 2 of my our county commissioners that are on there. We have every year been meeting with our Appropriations Commission for both the House and the Senate. What happens in Minnesota is we meet every year. There's usually a bonding year every other year. The other year has more to do with operating budget. But every year, we've been giving them updates of where things are at, what kinds of things we're looking for. When we've talked to the chairs of those key commissions, which is appropriations, they're the ones that bring it forward. I can't say that we've heard anything negative. It seems to be pretty positive in that way. We've usually given them at least 1 or 2 formal presentations with the PowerPoints and stuff like that. And then also we've gone down there. We usually will pull them out of committees and talk to them one-on-one. And so I think they're pretty up on what's going on, but by Minnesota rules, they can't ask for funding until the permit is given. So if it happens to be in November, December, that will be adequate time to start having those early conversations in January so that they have the potential for funding this next legislative session. Even though it's not an appropriations year, almost every year they do some degree of funding for flood protection, which goes pretty easily through the legislature. So at least I have a pretty good sense that we'll at least get portions of it right away because we'll be asking. And during those discussions, in general, we've been talking about 2% of the total cost. That is something that Minnesota, through their EIS, had determined was the Minnesota's portion, and we did a joint powers agreement 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And that was actually when I actually officially became on it, but that it would be the same as the Minnesota EIS's recommendation. And that's it, if that gives you kind of a feel where things are at. We are a little bit in limbo right now.
Any questions for the mayor?
Mayor, thank you for serving on the task force.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was fun sitting next to you most of the time.
Yep.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Six really fun days together.
I gotta admit, I was really impressed that you and Governor Dayton took that much time out. I mean, they were full-day meetings, basically. And especially Governor Dayton, since they were all in this area, so he would also have flying time down. That was really impressive for governors to do.
Representative Nelson has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mayor, just so I understand this correctly, from the Minnesota perspective, the Plan B is the only game in town, from your conversation, that would meet the EIS or your department's of EIS finding. Would, if that was not, if that became problematic, the time delay for another plan where would we be if that was problematic and we had to start over again? Would the whole, the governors have to reconvene and begin this process again? But from a permitting standpoint, what's the time delay from
Well,
your EIS?
A time delay would probably put us back a year. That would be a problem because cost of money, for one thing. When you get, we also have Ames Construction, which is a Minnesota business, which we've reminded Governor Dayton a couple of times on, is in limbo, for instance, and so that would be costly to stop and start that project. So I can't tell you a dollar amount in that regard, but it would probably be pricey. So this is really important that this happens. I can't say that the Minnesota DNR looks at it as the only. What they do is when you submit a plan, they will look at that plan in particular and does it fit the criteria that they need. And I know we've had, well, frankly, tons of meetings face-to-face with Commissioner Landmeer, Barb Naramore, his assistant commissioner, and I'm pretty sure they would give us indications that that was not one at any point that it came up. They could never promise it, but it seemed to fulfill what they were looking for.
Okay, well, I think it's important, for us to know, and from our tour yesterday, it appeared like there was a lot of support for Plan B, but I'm guessing we haven't heard from everybody yet.
Any other questions for the mayor? Seeing none, thank you very kindly,
Yeah,
ma'am.
thank you.
Appreciate it. Colonel, the podium is yours, and you've got lots of time.
Thank you, sir. So I think, the third presenter on the Fargo Moorhead diversion, and I think there are two to follow me. So I will try to go quickly through some of my slides and happy to answer any questions. But perhaps I can give you a different perspective from the federal government. I'll start by saying just quickly that I'm from the St. Paul district. We work with the Souris River and the Red River basins in the state of North Dakota. And of course, the Omaha district covers the Missouri River basin. And so I work very closely with Colonel John Hudson there, and we talk frequently about different things that are going on, but the decisions on projects like the Red River Valley water supply project are made from the Omaha district. So just if there's any confusion about that, I wanted to clear that up. And I always like to start by saying that the mission of the Corps is to enhance the nation's security, to reduce the risk from disaster, and to energize the economy. And I think that in the state of North Dakota, we're helping work with you and the local governments to do those three things. We've got permanent projects here, the Hami Dam and the Bald Hill Dam, that have been in place for a long time. We've done more recent work, as many of you are more familiar with than I am, in places like Devil's Lake, like Grand Forks, like Wahpeton. And we're very proud of the work that we do. We're very committed to continuing to work with you all. And the first slide I have here, if I go the right way, is really just to say thanks for the partnership. So a couple pictures here of recent visits we've had to Bismarck and Minot. Major General Rick Kaiser is the guy sitting next to Governor Burgum there. He was up a couple months ago. He's the Mississippi Valley Division Commander, so he has responsibility from the Canadian border down to the Gulf of Mexico and New Orleans. He is going to be up here again, I think in late October, along the Red River Valley in Marsh Lake, which is on the Minnesota side. But he's committed, the Corps is committed to what we're doing in North Dakota, and very appreciative of the partnership. I work with lots of people that are in this room very frequently and have great relationships and really appreciate all the support. I think everyone knows the purpose of this project, but I'd just like to reiterate what Mayor Mahoney said a few minutes ago. The 230,000 people in Fargo and the 250+ thousand in the FMM region are really the key to what it drives the Corps, really to want to deliver this project, to get it built, to get it done, and we're working hard to do that. We've been committed, as a couple people have said, for the past decade, and of course before that, building levees in the region, but working specifically on this project since 2008. I don't think I need to go through all that history, but in 2016 we executed a project partnership agreement, and literally that day advertised the first contract, and that's for the diversion inlet structure. So we haven't wasted time when we've had the opportunity to move in the past, and we don't intend on doing that in the future. Of course, the project, unfortunately, was placed under an injunction in federal court in, I think, about exactly a year ago today, September of 2017. I don't remember the specific date. We stopped construction that next day. We've been able to keep that construction contract alive. We haven't terminated it yet. Currently, it's suspended through the 15th of January. So as a few people have discussed, we're very hopeful that we'll have a permit by December, before the end of Governor Dayton's term. We're poised to work closely with the court and all the parties to that lawsuit as soon as we have a permit, and then to get construction moving again as quickly as possible. So we're committed to doing that. I think it's important to note that I think everyone knows what the federal commitment dollar-wise to this project is, but we've been funded to $103 million already. That includes $35 million in last year's budget, and then this year, if you've been following the federal budget process for the first time in more than 20 years, I think we have, for the earliest time, I should say, in more than 20 years, we already have our budget for fiscal year 19 that hasn't even started yet. So we expect within the next 60 days or so to know what the federal funding for this project will be in fiscal year 19. And we're hopeful that it's going to be significant funding. I think we've already talked enough about the task force, but share everybody's thanks to Governor Burgum and Governor Dayton for the commitment to getting that moving again. I don't know that it would have gotten moving without their personal leadership. I think most of us saw a lot of the changes that we call Plan B yesterday, so I won't dwell on this. And we talked about the current environmental reviews that are going on. Both the state of Minnesota's review and the federal review end, or the public comment periods end tomorrow at, I think the time is 4 p.m. So we made a concerted effort to have those two review periods line up so that the public only has to respond once to the two different surveys. We hope that'll increase the efficiency, reduce confusion about it. This slide shows some of the other options that a couple people have asked about that we considered. So there were other options, other suggestions. It's a little bit hard to see, but there's an orange line north of the red line, which is the current southern embankment that I think the Minnesota DNR has taken to call an alternative C, I think. They looked at that and screened that out as an option. And up to the north, there was a proposed alignment of the diversion channel itself that is shown in the yellow line there. Really, all those options were screened out because they were more expensive, had bigger impacts on the Fargo-Moorhead area, and really didn't further the purpose of the project. So those have all been screened out. The next two slides, and these are almost the last slides that I have, just show a little bit of the comparison of the project that we had been moving forward on previously and what Plan B does. I think that first bullet we haven't mentioned, or I haven't heard anybody mention it in the past 2 days, but previously the project was designed to operate on average once every 10 years, so for the 10-year flood. Now with the increased flows through town, it will probably on average only operate once every 20 years. And so what that does is reduces the impacts of people that live and work and farm south of the diversion, or of the southern embankment, I should say. So we really have done a lot that we've kind of heard from the Fargo perspective, creates more challenges within the metro area, but we've also done a lot of things that reduce the impacts outside of the metro area. We've talked about the balance between Minnesota and North Dakota as well. I think the last bullet there I know is important to people who live north of Fargo, maybe in Grand Forks or even up into Canada, but we've maintained with the redesign project those minimal impacts downstream. And social impacts are important, also environmental impacts. Really the last bullet on this slide is the one continuing point that, sticking point that we're working through with the state of Minnesota. Probably comes down to not whether they'll issue a permit, but what the conditions on that permit might be. And so we're working closely both with the State Water Commission here and with the Minnesota DNR to try to make sure that we can mitigate any of the impacts to the environment as well as social impacts. I think I've already mentioned this, and I think this is my last slide here. The way forward, this kind of talks a little bit about specifically the environmental assessment. But I did mention that we're poised to start construction again, hopefully very quickly after a permit decision, and then continue on. We hope that we'll get funding in fiscal year 19 to award a contract for the wild rice control structure, and we'll continue designing other portions of the project and don't intend to slow down after we have that permit and have the permission from the court to move forward. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Do we have any questions for the Colonel? Seeing none, thank you very kindly, sir.
Okay, you're welcome.
Mr. Grinberg, the podium is yours.
Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the Joint Committee. For the record, I'm Tony Grinberg, City Commissioner here at the City of Fargo. And much like the legislative process, the commission form of government's a mini legislature, and once you're elected, you're called in by the mayor and asked, what committees do you want to serve on? Just like when we're elected to the legislature, the leader sits down with you and aligns you with the committees of your interest. Mayor Mahoney made that call. We had our meeting, and he said, would you be interested in being on the Diversion Authority? And certainly with my perspectives and involvement in the 2013 session, I said, sure. And then he said, I'd like you to chair the Finance Committee. And I said, yes, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Mayor. I graciously agreed to step up and serve on the Diversion Authority with one of my responsibilities as City Commissioner, as well as chair the Finance Committee. And what it taught me, the experience so far to date, and the impact, if you will, of the leadership of the legislature and prior governors and Governor Burgum at present. From a legislative perspective, we do our work. We do what we think is right for the state of North Dakota and how it impacts people that go about their regular work in local government. And it wasn't too long as a member of the Diversion Authority, it was pretty apparent to me of the passion and the commitment that many people have put years of effort into and countless hours to bring us where we're at actually here today. And I couldn't help but reflect, when we look at the data and the statistics, I recall the tough decision former Mayor Bruce Furnace made in 1997 to seal off the city of Fargo on 32nd Avenue South and build an emergency levee to stop the water coming from the south. And that was a very difficult decision at the time to separate the city, but a decision had to be made to stop that water. And fortunately, in our case, Mother Nature helped us out. It got cold and it slowed the melt, and the water didn't come as fast as it was originally intended. And we also know the impact that happened later that year in Grand Forks. And then look back, fast forward 12 years to 2009, and the decisions made in this room that you're sitting in today, the difficult decisions and the pressure, if you will, based on Hurricane Katrina of evacuating the city of Fargo. And the impact and the decisions were made that we're going to fight this. And of course, many of you have heard the history and the testimony and the millions of sandbags and the community effort, which is all part of this discussion today about the FM diversion. So I have 6 slides, and the first 4 I think are maybe a repeat. You probably have heard these things in the past from former testimony, but the last 2 slides really kind of hone in on where we're going and what we need to accomplish as a diversion authority and as the finance chair. You can see the original, numbers that, with the local sales tax, the 1.1 billion, which we've always aligned with the Plan A, which is a $2.2 billion project. The federal government at 450 million, and at present, that escalates with inflation with the federal commitment of 479 million. The state of Minnesota at present, and then, of course, the 450 million that was in the 2013 legislative session, and then the additional 120 million for in-town, a total of 570. Next slide just shows a summary of where we're at with the state commitment. You can see we're at with 17 biennium here at 66.5.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Straley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have you guys determined what the shortfall is in that other pie? Or what the additional state funds you would, or local funds you would need?
I'll come back to that. We are still in development of the shortfall. Maybe in slides 5 and 6, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
So you see that 304 million of the 570 million has been appropriated to date. Some additional background information on the local. Funding at present makes up 66% of the non-federal share. Voters approved sales tax extensions until 2084. You can see the various votes of 2016 with 66% and 64% in support of the sales tax. And then the last bullet I'll just emphasize is with the financial markets and the discussion of having a possible assessment district is used as a tool to backstop the sales tax from a financing perspective for the financial markets for the project. And so it's important to distinguish that that will not be used for capital, but as a financing tool, as a backstop for the financing mechanism for the project. I think the Colonel mentioned some of this in his presentation, but 35 million has been included in the 2018 Army Corps plan. Federal funding to date at 103 million, and the total of 470 million at present for the federal commitment to the project. And back to Roscoe, Representative Straley's question, cost estimates are underway. The difference between Plan A at 2.2 billion and the revised cost estimate due to changes in Plan B, which has been shared with changes in town from 35 to 37 feet. Additional costs with the southern embankment, approximately 5 miles additional distance added to that, additional land costs, and then also the impact of delays is all being modeled, put together to come up with a new cost estimate that we'll have later this fall. And then, of course, as Mayor Mahoney alluded to, the additional costs of in-town levies and then home buyouts. And the next steps is that for that construction and financial plan is a critical component. Financial plan will also factor in the long-term revenue streams and the potential payback periods. Discussion of all the funding partners are needed. We will be making a formal request to the state of Minnesota once the permit is complete for increased Minnesota share. We're also having discussions with the federal delegation on federal share, and then expect that we would like to continue to have discussions with the partnership with the legislature and the governor's office on what's the additional requirement the state can help with the project, and then the overall long-term financing plan and affordability. And as one example that we're still, as a policy decision, that the Colonel mentioned with the Plan A of an event once every 10 years, and now a Plan B of an event, the probability once every 20 years, how many bridges do we build and the cost versus low water crossings? And that's an example of continuing engineering work to get to what's the new number when it looks at the impacts and the return on investment, if you will, with what we're going to put forward. So I hope that answers Representative Straley's question to some degree, but I can't give you a specific number today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I mean, I think it's clear, looking at the data versus other projects that are done. I mean, the state has to step up here. I mean, you can't do 66% of the local share. I think that's woefully, the state's commitment is inadequate. It needs to go up 200 or 300 million, I would say, at least, and cover the cost of whatever this increase is. It should be a state cost, I believe. And as far as the financing piece, you know, I'm assuming you're supportive of an idea to long-term borrow over 30, 40 years from whatever fund it would be as part of the local and the state share? From a legacy fund, for example?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Straley, I can answer that with two different hats. As personally, I support the concept, and second, I can tell you as a member of the Diversion Authority, we're very interested, and that will really assist in our financing long-term play with low-interest loan programs. How you as a legislature deal with how to make that opportunity for us, we'll work with you, but we'll be able to provide the data and how that really drives down the cost for this project.
Any other comments from Mr. Greenberg? Nothing else?
Thank you.
Thank
I feel
you,
like
sir.
I'm back at home.
Beg your pardon?
I think I'm back at home with the work of this committee and my former hat years ago, and looking at Senator Robinson, and I won't say what I'm going to think. Thank you.
Thank you. We're ahead of schedule. Let's keep going, and any added time that we have this morning we'll add to our lunch period. So, but we will take a break after Mr. Shockley here. Podium is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. My name is John Shockley, and I serve as General Counsel to the Diversion Authority and also the P3 lead for the project. I thought that it would be good to have an overview of the project P3 delivery model and then just answer some general questions regarding the P3 delivery model. The P3 delivery is being delivered through the split delivery, which is codified in the project partnership agreement that the Colonel had spoken about that was signed on July 11th of 2016. Under that agreement, the project is really split into two major components. The first component is the diversion channel and the associated infrastructure. That's being delivered through the P3 model, with the local sponsor heading up the procurement and the delivery of that, and then the southern embankment, which is being delivered through traditional core procurement model. The Corps of Engineers is been very integral in the P3 procurement model. This is their first project that they've utilized P3 for. It's a pilot project for the Corps. The United States Congress directed the use of P3 and the study of P3. This is the only P3 project going on in the country, so there's a lot of opportunity for the Corps of Engineers to learn how to utilize P3 in the industry and with water projects around the country. As a result, the Corps of Engineers is vested in the project's success. I can tell you from being the P3 project lead, the Corps has been lock and step with the Diversion Authority throughout the P3 procurement, and it's been a great experience for both parties. Why did the Corps of Engineers and the federal government look to use P3 as a procurement model? Quite simply, P3 recognizes the speed of construction and efficiency on large projects. Large projects oftentimes take years, even decades, to assemble and complete and then become operational. The P3 model is especially suited for large projects because it increases the rate of construction, and so the project is delivered to the public faster and usually has more innovation put into the project. This project will likely become a model for future project delivery by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. As a side note, those of you who are familiar with the current administration's infrastructure plan, oftentimes there's been an emphasis on the use of P3, and P3, especially in this model, in which a lot of the local funds are being leveraged at a higher percentage than federal funds, has been very attractive to the administration. DJ Gibbons, former advisor to President Trump, had noted that part of the infrastructure plan that was being floated around Congress, which is now going to be extended past the midterms, had included a lot of consideration for P3 and looking at the amount of funds that would be utilized by local sponsors and state sponsors versus the federal government. And so this is why this project is very important to the United States Army Corps of Engineers, because it matches that model and it can be utilized for future procurement. So what exactly is P3? At the end of the day, it's really a model for procurement and an agreement between the public sector and a private entity in which each party identifies the risks, properly allocates those risks to each party, who can best share them, and then the project is delivered. The facility is still owned by the public. It's still available for the public to utilize. It's just putting the best party in control of the risks that it's best able to handle. So any discussion of P3 requires just a brief overview of the traditional models of procurement, which is design, bid, build. And you're probably familiar with that model, as that's utilized throughout most of North Dakota, in which the public agency is required for securing its own funding, whether that comes through grant or comes through the issuance of debt, through either a loan through the Bank of North Dakota or through seeking debt from the private market. The public agency then has to secure a contract with the design engineer. Once the design engineer has completed its design, that is put out for public bids. Construction company bids on it. Another contract is entered into with the public entity. The element is then handed back to the public sector, and the public sector is responsible for performing the operations and maintenance. As you can see in this situation, there's a lot of opportunities for conflict between the design, the construction, and the operations and maintenance. There's also the potential for inefficiencies in that the design engineer is often on a different team than the construction contractor and on a different team than the person performing operations and maintenance. Under a typical P3 model, and I would first note that P3 isn't for every project. P3 is a procurement model that is suited for specific projects. It usually works better in larger projects, but it can be utilized in smaller projects. A good example of a P3 that was recently utilized, those of you who are familiar with the city of West Fargo, there's a downtown development that's going on that was undertaken using P3 procurement and has been very successful, but it's a smaller P3. So under your typical P3 model, the public agency enters into a development agreement with the P3 developer. The P3 developer is then required to secure debt, so they take on the debt. It's no longer the public entity's responsibility to go out to the private markets and secure funding, and they also secure equity from their shareholders. And because they have equity into the transaction, they have incentive to complete the project on time. The P3 developer is then required to enter into contracts with its own engineer, with its own construction contractor and subcontractors, and then enter into a contract with an entity to provide operations, maintenance, and other services as set forth by the public entity. Oftentimes, this causes the equity holders to ensure that the engineer is talking with the contractors, is talking with the operations and maintenance parties. It also gives an opportunity for the engineers and the contractors to talk about what's the most efficient means to undertake construction. A good example was a project in Texas in which a tunnel was proposed. It was bid out on P3, and the P3 contractor came out, and instead of building a tunnel, they utilized two T-shapes. So they had an underground pass. The tunnel was open, and it had a T on the top. It saved a significant amount of construction costs, and it delivered the project much faster. And that's really the benefit on large projects. You allow that innovation and that conversation to occur between the engineer and the contractor, which on a traditional project doesn't necessarily always occur because there's a concern by the engineer, rightfully so, of some liability issues if they're directing the means and methods of how the construction is being undertaken. So, what does that mean with respect to the P3 procurement project with respect to the diversion? In this model, this is the model that the diversion authority is currently utilizing for the P3 procurement, which is just related to the diversion channel and associated infrastructure. The first step in the process is to undertake a due diligence, which is the review of do we have the proper easements, do we have the proper engineering documents? Do you have the proper reviews? And then really finding out what the industry considers to be the proper allocation of risks for a project. With respect to diversion, this was undertaken right around the time that the PPA was signed. We had numerous meetings with private industry representatives. At one point in time, we had up to 8 teams that were interested in this project. All of those teams were international and national in character. You may ask, why would they be interested in a project in North Dakota? To be frank, it's the same reason that the Corps is interested in this project. This is likely the model for the future for large infrastructure projects related to flood control. And thus, getting your name on a big project with national significance is a great business model for future business. We then had a formal meeting that occurred here in Fargo in which it was referred to as an industry day that allowed the Diversion Authority and the Corps to present information about the project. We then sent out what is referred to as a request for qualifications. That request for qualifications required firms that were interested to submit their qualifications to perform for the project. That included information regarding their financial ability, their equity partners, their ability to close on the transaction, their engineering experience, and their contractor's experience. We received 6 responses from the industry, and I will say that these responses are quite in-depth. They're over 2 to 3 binders of volumes of information. We had anticipated that we would receive a 7th, but at the last minute, the 7th decided not to submit because one of its equity partners decided not to participate. We then had the P3 technical team review, and 3 of the 6 were selected to move forward to the next phase. Those shortlisted bidders were selected in October of 2016. And the Diversion Authority then began to draft what is referred to as the request for proposals, which goes to the shortlisted bidders. The request for proposals really has 3 significant components. The first is the instructions to proposers. That's really the rules of the game. How do you put your proposal together? The second is the actual agreement, and the third are referred to as the technical requirements. Now, as we have seen in the prior slide, the Diversion Authority doesn't necessarily send out plans and specs for the diversion channel. We do send out technical requirements that the teams have to propose within. And so really the difference is, instead of having a drawing for what a foundation should look like, a technical spec would say the building needs a foundation. And that's at the stage that we're in. We were getting close to being ready to issue our final RFP, which the teams would bid against. And then as mentioned, we received the injunction, and so we halted the P3 activities. I'm happy to report that all 3 teams have hung in there. We expect that they will continue to hang in as long as the project is continuing to make success on the permitting front, which all indications, as Mayor Delray Williams had indicated, are positive. And so that's why we'd circled the request for proposals. That's where we're at in the list. Once we're ready to resume, we would anticipate issuing the RFP to the teams, and then we would select the successful proposer from the 3, based both upon their technical submission and their financial submission. Under state statute, we're required to have a public hearing before we make the final award. Then we would approve, and then we would reach financial and commercial close, and we would anticipate construction beginning 6 to 8 months after the issuance of the RFP. I would note that there's a misnomer about P3, and that P3 is not necessarily a financing solution. P3 is an innovative way to construct a project, to deliver a project. Oftentimes, I've been asked to present to different groups, to different DOTs, and the question always comes up, is this going to solve the financing problem? It doesn't necessarily solve the financing problem. It makes delivering the project cheaper, more cost-effective, and faster, but you still have to pay the money back somehow. It doesn't create money on its own. And so I think that's, anytime you go to the market, you got to make sure that you have a strong financial plan. So why do we use P3 in this transaction? The public sector here, the diversion authority, will continue to retain ownership and control of the asset. So it's not privatization of public infrastructure. The diversion authority continues to own the diversion channel. It's just we're transferring some of the responsibilities for the project operations and maintenance to the private sector. We're retaining when the project is operated, but we're requiring them to maintain the project. The public agency here, the diversion authority, continues to maintain control over operating standards, when it's operated, how it's operated, and other requirements that it chooses. Those can be adjusted in a P3 agreement. In some types of P3s, you'll see more of that operations responsibility shifted to the private sector. Here, because it's a flood control device, we wanted to retain as much of the operations responsibility as possible. One of the highlights of P3 is that you get the innovative technical solutions because the private industry is incentivized because they want to win the bid. So they come up with more innovative technical solutions as long as they're within the technical requirements. The other highlights are that the engineer and contractor on the private side work collectively. They lower construction and deploy new technology. Oftentimes, they'll come up with different ways to attack a problem that maybe the public sector didn't necessarily think about. And the other reason they can do that is they're responsible for operating and maintaining the project. So if they figure out a solution that's perhaps a little bit lower on capital and a little bit higher on operations and maintenance costs, that's a risk they can take. The public sector receives a fixed price. That fixed price is a capital price and an operations and maintenance price. And I like to say that it's a more transparent process than your typical construction process in which you get a capital bid, but the public never sees what's the long-term operating cost. With a P3, you know up front what your long-term operating costs are. I liken it to a school. Oftentimes, a school is built, but the public never understands how much does it cost to maintain that building over 30 years. If you built a school building utilizing a P3, you would get the capital costs, and then you'd also receive a bid on how much does it cost per year to operate that building for the next 30 or 40 or 50 years, and that risk is taken on by the P3 private sector. It also provides a speed up of delivery of the project. As you've heard, delays in time for construction of the project increase costs. The contractors for P3 don't get paid unless the project is completed, so they have a direct incentive that is enforced both by the banks and by their equity partners to complete the project on time. Private equity holds the debt and it's incentivized to deliver the project. Most projects will have availability payment or some other type of payment mechanism that is not received by the private sector until the project is substantially complete and in operation. So for example, if a project is requiring the construction of a road and a tunnel and has a date that's set certain when the project is to be delivered to the public, and they miss that date, they don't receive their availability payment. So equity and the banks are at risk of not receiving payment, so it incentivizes them to work to complete on time. Some of the other advantages that I went over, it's certainty in cost, you have certainty in schedule. It talks about innovative designs, and the long-term availability payment continues to act like an insurance policy. So in our project, they receive the availability payment, but we have the right to set off if they're not performing operations and maintenance up to a certain specified standard. So if they're not maintaining the road, or the road crossings, or the bridges, or the ditch in a certain manner that's within the specifications of the agreement, we have the ability to deduct money from their availability payment. And so that incentivizes the private sector to make sure that they are properly performing the operations and maintenance, because otherwise they're not going to receive their availability payment.
Sir, I have a question, if I may.
Sure.
What occurs under a P3 if there is downtime due to cultural resources found during construction or an environmental concern, and the project is shut down? Is that the responsibility then of the public agency, or is that the responsibility of the private entity?
That, first of all, that's a great a great question. How that is handled in the P3 world is that is a negotiated matter through the contract. So during the due diligence period and the negotiations, the parties will decide how that risk is allocated. So in some transactions, that risk is entirely borne by the private sector. If the private sector feels that, they have sufficient safeguards or protections, they will proceed and enter into the agreement. If it's an existing right-of-way where there's an interstate that's already there and the risk is very low, oftentimes they will enter into that agreement. In certain other projects, like if they're rehabbing a railroad crossing or some other type of property that might have the risk of contamination, there's often a lot of discussion, and that could be shared by the parties, or it could be what is called a compensation event. If there's a delay that's outside the control of the P3 contractor, then the public entity has to pay a compensation event, which is just extra money for that shutdown. In our particular project, we had shifted most of that burden onto the P3 developer. We did had envisioned that we would share a little bit of the responsibility if it was an unknown cultural condition. But I would say in this particular project, the Corps has done extensive amounts of surveys on the property and is aware of all the cultural issues that might present themselves. So I think there was a high level of confidence from the P3 teams, at least on the cultural side, that the risk was fairly low of a delay for cultural issues.
Okay, and if I may, second part to that, if there's something where you have a design failure and you go into construction and you go into an as-built or whatever the case may be there, and there's a change in that, is that also the same scenario as it would be if it was cultural resources, or is that something different? Because if it's a design deficiency, that, my thoughts would not be to the public entity, but more to the private sector?
That's correct. If there's a design failure where the P3 contractor's engineer has a design failure, that is all the risk shared by the P3 developer. That is no risk on the public entity. So if there's a design failure, they would not receive their availability payment. And so their engineering team has to make sure that their design is up to a specified criteria. Otherwise, they're not going to receive payment either. And that's all that risk is taken on by the private sector.
Thank you. Representative Mitskog.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple questions. Can you maybe talk briefly on the downside or risks of entering in a P3? It sounds like we're kind of entering in uncharted waters here with a federal project. I'm just curious if you...
So analyzing what the downsides of a risk of a P3 are really two parts. First of all, you have to look during your due diligence phase whether or not the project is right for a P3. In our case, we looked at whether or not a P3 was right for this project, and that was the genesis of the split delivery of the project. You'll note the Corps is constructing the southern embankment, and we're constructing the diversion channel and associated infrastructure. The engineering risk that's associated with the diversion channel is less than the engineering risk that would be associated with the construction of the southern embankment. And the Corps has years of experience in constructing those elements. And so the Corps was really the right party to handle that type of construction because their elements are robust, they're long-lasting, they're designed to have minimal maintenance by the public sector throughout the country. You'll often see Corps facilities that are designed that have been in operations for 50 or 100 years, and they're very robust. And so it was felt from kind of an overall standpoint that a risk standpoint, we would mitigate our risk as a diversion authority by taking responsibility for the diversion channel and associated infrastructure. The second phase is really looking at the contract and how you adjust and share that risk of the project. And so in our case, we have transferred most all of the risk to the private sector regarding the risk of excavation, some of those big risks. So I think that the question is really, you have to look at who's drafting your agreements, and if you're properly allocating the risk to the private sector, then you can mitigate your risk. I think that in the water sector around the country, that there's been, P3 is relatively new to flood protection, but it can be accomplished if you have, a thoughtful consideration of what the risks are, first identifying them, and then properly allocating them within your development agreement. If that-
And one last question. So the maintenance component of this, because I'm very familiar with our Wapton project. Once you construct, that maintenance is a big part of a project that's ongoing. So the maintenance then shifts to the private side, the responsibility?
Yes, just for the diversion channel and associated infrastructure. So for the term of the agreement, which in this case would be construction period plus 30 years, which we're assuming the construction period for the diversion channel and the associated infrastructure would be approximately 5 years. The agreement would be then 30 years following that. The private sector is responsible for the maintenance of the facility. The technical requirements go into great detail about what's required to maintain the ditch, so to speak, and the crossings and the highways. And if they are not able to properly perform their maintenance, they are at risk for not receiving their availability payment. And to go back to the availability in this case, payment is equal to about 60% of the total capital investment in the project. So during construction, they'll get about 40% of the payment just prior to the end of construction, which is referred to as a milestone, but the remaining 60% of the cost of the construction plus operation and maintenance is payable to over a period of 30 years. So they have a great incentive to make sure that they're properly maintaining the channel and the bridges. And the agreement also specifies what is referred to as a handback reserve. And a handback reserve means that they have to, the private developer has to put so much funds into a reserve account. So when the bridges and the channel is handed back to the public entity, there is money available to make those repairs. The other thing that the public entity can do to protect itself, which we have here, is really looking to what are in the technical requirements for the underlying infrastructure, because you can draft your technical requirements to have a bridge life with 30 years, or you can draft it to have a bridge life with 50 years. And so we have drafted it for the later, for longer-term bridge construction, because the bridges will be handed over to Cass County, ultimately for maintenance. And the desire is with that reserve handback fund and with the bridges having longer life, the county will be well-suited to continue the maintenance after that operations and maintenance period has completed with the developer.
Thank you. Please continue with your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just briefly going over the payment mechanisms in general, there are traditional P3 payment mechanisms. Those are revenues. We're not really using that in this project. Oftentimes P3 started with tolls and user fees, and that was the private sector was charged with constructing an interstate highway system, and then they were given the authority to charge tolls. That's not the case here. Milestone payments. Milestone payments are large payments that are agreed upon by the public sector and the private sector. That is, the private sector during construction meets certain construction milestones, they receive a percentage of the total payment. So that can vary depending on the type of project. Here we are using some milestone payments. We haven't finalized what those milestone payments amount are, but they are always less than the amount of infrastructure that's installed, and they are always less than the total value of the capital payment of the project to ensure that the public entity is protected. And availability payments, that is the system that we're using here. An availability payment is an annual payment that is made to the P3 developer that goes through the term of the agreement, or as the industry refers to the agreements as concession agreements. And once again, if they're not meeting the criteria for operations and maintenance, the public sector is able to set off money from the availability payment. The diversion channel we're using will receive a bid that has a fixed capital component and an operations and maintenance component. So when we finally do reach a point at which we have bids, we'll know precisely what the capital cost is and what the operations and maintenance costs will be for the period of the agreement. And we'll be utilizing availability and milestone payments. And I'm happy to answer any questions. It's a subject that I'm very interested in and enjoy answering questions about.
Commissioner Anderson.
Thank you. Mr. Shockley, I'm understanding the efficiencies that are found in the P3 model. I just want you to maybe explain where the actual financial savings could come into play. Is that because the interest rate of traditional bonding is higher than what the return on investment for the equity and the debt is to the P3? Where is that actual financial savings located?
So the question regarding the financial savings comes in the time period of construction. And not every project is well suited for P3. You really have to look at the underlying construction. Here, if you constructed the diversion channel using traditional means and methods, you'd have a very long construction cycle, perhaps longer than 10 or 15 years for a traditional construction cycle. P3 allows you to shorten that construction cycle, and that allows you to limit the amount of increase in construction costs over the years. And so P3 shortens the cost, reduces your cost, not from a financial perspective, from an interest rate, but it reduces your construction costs. And so that's why I always kind of start out that there's a kind of a misperception in the marketplace that P3 is about financing. It's more about procurement and project delivery, and that's why not every project is well suited for P3. Like a traditional road project in a city that's $50 million that takes 1 year to build probably is not well suited for P3. But if it's got some unique moving parts and you want to bring in some innovation or long construction cycles, then P3 is your better solution because it will lower your capital costs, and if you lower your capital costs, it saves money for the project.
If I may?
Continue.
Do you graph that out so that at some point you realize if the cost of bonding interest rate, say, is so low that there's no way that the savings of the capital overcomes that? So for example, if you had 0% financing for this project, is P3 still the right option and it's still enough efficiency to find savings?
So another great question. We've seen that in different projects where public entities throughout the country have attempted to perform that analysis. And at some point, you have to be careful in how you structure your analysis because you can start to assume how, if we assume that capital is 0%, then is that a realistic assumption? Is capital 4%? Is it 2%? And so I think that there is a point at which it probably makes more sense to go the traditional route than P3, but you really have to, it's really a case-by-case study. You have to look at the underlying project, what is the public sector trying to accomplish, and then also look at your cost of capital, because I have seen projects where you can have a financial consultant come in and they can use an interest rate of 6%, and then P3 looks really attractive, or they can use an interest rate of 0% and it doesn't look attractive. And so it's really during that due diligence period, they really have to examine whether or not the project is well suited. And that's why we spent nearly 6 months in the due diligence process with this project, and the Corps spent quite a bit of time working with them, talking about why P3 was best suited for this project, and working through some of the details of how a P3 would operate with core rules and requirements for such things as the embedded levee within the channel.
One more?
Go ahead.
And then I just want to know from the investor side, if we were to use traditional bonding, these would have been tax exempt bonds. Is there a tax advantage to the equity or the debt investors into the P3?
So the P3 sector will traditionally utilize equity for a component of its total investment, and the equity can range anywhere from 10% to 30% for a transaction. We specify as the public entity how much private equity is in there. The return on that equity is something that really the public entity doesn't see because that's within the team. Traditionally for the financing, the teams will try to secure what is called a private activity bonds allocation. There are special provisions within the IRS tax code that allow a private entity that is constructing public infrastructure to take advantage of tax exempt borrowing. The public entity has to secure what is referred to as a private activity bond allocation. We, as a diversion authority, we have moved towards securing that private activity bonds allocation. For this particular project, that comes through the United States Department of Transportation. We've had outreaches with them. We have secured what is referred to as a conduit issuer. You have to have a conduit issuer that is willing to issue the debt. They take on the responsibility and work with the P3 contractor, so it doesn't appear on the diversion authority books that's to private sector, but they still can issue tax-exempt bonds. There was also some discussion in the last tax code changes about giving some tax benefits to equity investors within P3s. I don't know if that necessarily materialized, but there's been some more discussion about it. With the lower corporate interest rate, that issue sort of went to the side because now the investors receive a lower corporate interest rate, so we're seeing more of a desire to put equity into these transactions because of the lower corporate corporate tax rate.
Are there any other questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Bowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, on the tax note, is there a depreciation component to these partnerships where they can utilize the depreciation that is no value to the governmental institutions?
It depends upon how they structure it internally. They can take depreciation, so the entity, oftentimes when they have large projects that are $3 and $4 billion, they will depreciate, they'll buy all the equipment up front for the construction and depreciate that out. That's really, each project is going to depend upon the private sector's use of their capital, use of their depreciation, their tax planning, but yes, there are advantages for the private sector to depreciate their equipment out, and we have seen that because they look at how much equipment they can bring into a project and whether they should buy it and write it off or they should lease it. I mean, those are really some discussions that happen behind the curtain that we don't see, that all of those issues will help them lower their bid because each of the teams wants to have the lowest bid, so whatever advantages, whether tax or financing they can achieve, they all look to them.
Any other questions?
I just want to say at the very beginning, Mr. Shockley was talking about this administration's interest in private-public partnerships and in projects like this. Lieutenant Governor Sanford and I had a chance to be invited to the White House last year for Infrastructure Day. This specific project actually came up in the discussions because it's unusual, even if you look across the whole country, that there has already been a vote of the people to tax themselves for 50 years to fund it, when most of the projects that the other governors and others were bringing up in the dialogue were saying, we want 80% federal, we want 80% federal. You know, we're here at 20% federal. We got the Army Corps of Engineers engaged and supportive. We've got, multi-states, multi-entities, and so there was a lot of interest. So I think when we're saying we have a potential for a model here to save money for the whole country with the new approach, but I think it's also a model that could make sense, as Mr. Shockley says, in certain projects for North Dakota going forward, if we can figure out, basically this is a design-build model that's been used in the private sector for years to, speed delivery of projects and reduce upfront costs and get more clarity around ongoing operating costs, which is sometimes missed when we just pay cash for entities. We pay cash for construction and then we don't have a discussion about the ongoing operating costs. So I think this has a lot of appeal to it, and I think it could have other applications to infrastructure in our state going forward. And there's, under this administration, a lot of interest in this project. And I think, again, the work that we're doing here gives us an opportunity to go back through our congressional delegation and push hard for at least 20% of the total project funding from the feds, because if you talk about a $1 trillion administration infrastructure project, which is a number they're always talking about, but they were talking about getting to $1 trillion with $200 billion of federal appropriation. If you do the simple math, that means, we're moving from an era where people want the federal government to pay 80 and then, local pays 10 and state pays 10. We might be moving towards an era where Fed pays 20 and local and state have to come up with 80. But in that environment, who should be at the front of the line? The people at the front of the line for those federal dollars ought to be people where there's already proven long-term source of repayment. And, there wasn't any, there was no brighter example than a community that had already voted for 50 years to tax themselves to pay for a piece of infrastructure. And I think that, again, could be a way forward for federal allocation of dollars instead of, who shouts the loudest, who's got the most political clout. It was suggested that a way to distribute federal dollars would give it to the places that have already committed the most amount of local. Because then it's like a reverse Dutch auction where federal dollars flow to the place where it's got the highest match. And if you're looking at it with your federal hat on, giving the money to the person that's willing to match it at the highest rate locally would be the way to stretch a federal tax dollar. And in that scenario, this project would be at the front of the line of about any project in the country.
Any further comments? Seeing none, thank you very much, sir. Let's take a break and come back at 10:15, please. 10:15.
Come back.
Okay. All right, let us reconvene, please. Let us move on to our 1020 presentation by Ms. Sherling. The podium is yours, ma'am.
Thank you. Let's see. Oh. This button? No. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Mary Sherling. I'm the Vice Chair of the Cass County Commission, the Vice Chair of the Diversion Board of Authority, and I am also the Chairman of the Land Management Committee. That committee is made up of a variety of folks from representing different aspects of the project, including both Cass and Clay County, Fargo, Moorhead, the water resource districts, and most recently we've invited the mayor of Horace, North Dakota, to join us. First of all, we'll discuss the land acquisition progress. The following property rights are needed for project construction and operation: in-town levies in Fargo-Moorhead. There are 100 homes, 10 businesses, 30 have been acquired to date. The diversion channel itself, 220 parcels have been impacted, 45 have been acquired to date. Southern embankment, 150 parcels impacted, 10 acquired to date. And then the upstream mitigation area, there's the Oxbow, Hickson-Bocke ring levee, and then flowage easements with 750 parcels total, 100 residential properties and 20 farmsteads. There have been 200 parcels acquired to date and 150 residential units mitigated to date, and that includes in the city of Fargo 120 residents in the Park East apartment building. This is a map of the land acquisitions, the parcels impacted by the footprint of the diversion channel and the southern embankment. There's approximately 8,000 acres that are needed for the project construction. When we look at land acquisition, we actually would start, in the current proposal, we would start at the north end and work our way down south and then meet up with the inlet structures. That, depending on the P3 partner, that process could change, but that's how we're acquiring properties at this point, is north to south. We have a property rights acquisition and mitigation plan. It's a 150-page plan that was drafted in coordination with the U.S. Army Corps and in consultation with the North Dakota State Water Commission and the Minnesota DNR. The comprehensive plan details the approach and process for the property acquisitions and the methods to mitigate property impacts. They include what the typical property acquisition process would be: flowage easement plan, dispute resolution board, cemetery mitigation plans, mitigation of historic places, post-operation debris cleanup, post-operation repair for both public and private lands, a summer operational supplemental crop loss programs. The list goes on and on. It is a living document, and we are currently on version 4. The property acquisition process details the property rights determined by the project design. The valuation is determined by appraisal following state law, and then property owners receive just compensation for the real estate And in addition to that, relocation benefits for moving, relocation, and reestablishment. There have been 200 acquired to date, as I mentioned before, and by and large, those property owners have been mostly satisfied with the process and the result. The diversion project includes a mitigation area upstream of the project, which would be south, which is occasionally and temporarily using stored floodwaters. A flowage easement will be purchased and applied to properties upstream. Value of the easements will be determined through an appraisal that will consider the depth, duration, and frequency of additional flooding. The Diversion Authority has contracted with Crown Appraisals to develop a process and policy to value easements. Phase 1 of the study is underway now, and it should be completed shortly, and then we'll move into Phase 2. We've gotten some concerns from producers about debris and damage left over after the project operation. The operation, as was mentioned in previous presentations here, would operate approximately every 20 years. And then generally, historically, that would only happen in early spring before anyone got out into their fields. The flowage easements compensate landowners for impacts associated with the project. The project may cause debris to accumulate with the upstream mitigation area, impacting producers. The Diversion Authority developed a post-operation debris cleanup plan for both private, public, and properties, and the private one is mirrored after cleanup week in the Fargo-Moorhead area, and the public plan is mirrored after FEMA disaster assistance. Supplemental crop loss program has also been included in this mitigation program. The summer operation is extremely unlikely, but if there was a summer flooding, that would likely damage growing crops. We will provide a program for producers to cover the crop loss risks associated with project-induced flooding during summer months. There are 5 cemeteries upstream of the project that may be impacted at varying levels during major floods due to operation of the project. Plan B reduced the impacted cemeteries from 11 to 5 that was in the previous plan. Additionally, there are 21 cemeteries that currently flood that will now have improved flood protection due to the project. Flowage easements will be purchased from each cemetery, and there will be potential additional mitigation for each site that will be reviewed, and discussed with each cemetery after completion of the environmental and permitting review. And then finally, there's a dispute resolution board. It's an administrative program for properties that believe they are impacted by the project but do not receive direct mitigation. It's modeled after similar process created by the North Dakota State Water Commission for the Devil's Lake Outlet Project, and it allows a forum for property owners to file claims and an independent and fair process to determine damages from the project. And it also avoids expensive legal action. And that concludes my presentation. I certainly can take any questions that you might have.
Any questions? Any questions for Ms. Shirley? Seeing none, thank you very kindly, ma'am.
Thank you.
And I'd like to recognize that Representative Carlson has joined us at the table. It's nice to have you here, sir. Thank you for being with us. And we'll move on to our next presentation by Mr. Peterson.
Good morning. Good morning, Governor, Lieutenant Governor, Chairman Schmidt, and members of the Water Topics Overview Committee and the State Water Commission. My name is Matt Peterson. I am a commissioner on the State Water Commission representing the Upper Red River Basin District. I've been asked to speak on the State Water Commission's role in the FM Area Flood Protection Project, and I think actually Commissioner Grinberg and I had the same speechwriter, so if there's repetition, I apologize. My presentation is pretty brief. I'll just kind of give you a quick little intro on how I came to be on the Water Commission. I live in Valley City, and the last 8 years served as a commissioner for the city of Valley City. I was propelled to run after the 2009 flood, wanting to find a solution to flooding in Valley City. So I led a task force, permanent flood protection task force for the community, and I had an opportunity to speak in front of the Water Topics Overview Committee multiple times, as well as the State Water Commission, and would just like to thank you for all of your tremendous support for our community. And so I wanted to transition my role in public service from a city commissioner to serving on the Water Commission. I wanted to give back to the community and give back to the organization that's done so much for my community, and it's great to be part of the Water Commission and helping other communities. So in terms of the Water Commission, the Water Commission was formed in 1937 and has served as the primary mechanism to fund water development projects in our state. In regards to the FM Area Flood Protection Project, the State Water Commission's role remains the same in that the legislature has utilized the State Water Commission as a conduit to route funding to this project along with many other projects. The FM Area Flood Protection is not a project of the Water Commission. We are executing on the legislative directives as they establish funding. After the core feasibility study, the legislature began appropriating funds in 2009. And as we can see on this slide, just kind of a brief finance history, in the 2009-2011 biennium, House Bill 1020 appropriated $45 million. Following that, the next biennium, Senate Bill 2020 appropriated $30 million. We get to 2013-2015, House Bill appropriated an additional $100 million. And then 2015 is where the Senate Bill 2020 included the intent for total state commitment of $570 million. And we can see in the upper right of this slide, $370.5 million of that has been approved thus far. Of that amount, the $66.5 million in the 2017-2019 biennium, that is going to be requested from the project in the December 2018 meeting of the State Water Commission, and is the intention of the diversion project to use that for land acquisition. Also note that the 2015-2017 $129 million there, $60 million of that was designated specifically for Fargo interior flood control. Of the $370.5 million that has been appropriated to date, the project has spent $247 million. They're going to request, as I previously stated, they're going to request the additional $66.5 million in December, and the remaining is a small carryover balance. The FM area diversion project has also incorporated 3 more state funding grants of $66.5 million each in 2019, 2021, and 2023, and forecasted that into their projected expenditures, and that would round out the state's commitment of $570 million approved in Senate Bill 2020 and 2015. Kind of looking at the overall funding picture, to date there's been $792.5 million that's been approved. The allocation of $370.5 million, or 47% from the state of North Dakota, which we detailed out in the previous slide. An additional $330 million from local and federal, 92 million, and some we heard today upwards of 103 million, so somewhere in that range. The local funding has been secured by two city sales tax and 1 county sales tax, and those taxes have been approved through the year 2084. On the right side of this slide, this is currently assuming a $2.2 billion project with $1.4 billion approved thus far. And the question mark really represents the Plan B changes and the subsequent ask that will come to state, federal, and local funding sources. Looking ahead, in summary, the original legislative intent of $570 million has $199.5 million that remains to be appropriated over the next 3 bienniums, ending in 23 through 2025. Already stated that we're waiting on anticipated permits from the state of Minnesota that will then move to the cause the project to come to the Water Commission in December to request the additional $66.5 million from the 2017-2019 appropriation. And unknowing yet at this point what the Plan B increased cost would mean to the state of North Dakota's total financial commitment. With that, I would yield take any questions.
Any questions for the commissioner? If not, I have one, Matt, if I may. Previously there was the 2-year planning documents that we base our funding on for state water, and there was some discussion that the commission was going to move to a 10-year plan, or at least look at what a 10-year plan would cost us. And I was wondering if you could just tell us what the progress is on working on that 10-year plan?
Yeah, actually, and I think we have Pat and obviously Garland in the room as well, but at our last subcommittee meeting, we actually saw some of the initial plan there where for the water plan, we have laid out a long history, even beyond 10 years, and so that work is in progress. Yep.
Okay, another question, if I may, unless you'd like to respond, Mr. Go ahead.
Well, yes, right now we do have a draft form of what 10-year needs looks like. We are going to firm that up and then be presenting at our next meeting.
Okay, thank you. And then another question is, this is obviously our last interim meeting before the session. And one of the concerns that we've had previously was after the session was over and the State Water Commission budget was approved and passed and we had included an emergency clause, there was at times a delay between the end of the session and by the time we were able to allocate the money and get the funds out. And I really hope that we can expedite that and get those funds out to these projects quicker than what we've been able to do. And if there's something we need to do to help that situation, please let us know. Because we end up, in some cases, losing that summer of construction.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there's a cash flow issue there and so forth and so on. So I'm hoping that we can get those funds out quicker. Then the other thing is that I usually have Dave give us a little presentation on the summary on the dollar figures, but we kind of let him off the hook for this. But I think it's also critical that projects that are not spending money, that release money, that and you are following up on that. You've got a 4-year thing that you're dealing with now, and
Yep.
that's a wonderful thing. But that released money now that we can take and put it right back into that bucket from which it came, to expedite getting those dollars out to the communities that are building projects. And I applaud your efforts to do that. I know that you did it with Minot with $20 million that they saved on their bids, and you turned that back to the city to be used. And I would hope that we would continue to do that so that we're not sitting on funds until the next session. And so I applaud your efforts to make that real. And I realize that it probably takes a little bit more work on your effort to do that, but it's well worth it to the people that you do.
Agreed.
So with that, any
Thank you,
other
Mr. Chairman.
comments? Governor Yam.
Just appreciate your acknowledgement and encouragement. Commissions and the subcommittees and the staff have done some great work on trying to tighten this up to make sure that we don't just have money sitting around and the money gets out. So we're on the same page on that one. So thank you. Okay. And Matt, thanks for the presentation. Any other questions for Matt? Commissioners?
Okay, with that, thank you very kindly. And let us go on to our next Representative Striley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't remember from last meeting, but what did we determine the additional revenues that are flowing into the fund, obviously is substantially over budget. What did we determine, where was that going? Was that does it have to wait until next session to appropriate that, Claire, or was that something that could be spent?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Striley, members of the commission and committee, money that's been freed up from terminated projects can be reallocated back to their original buckets.
No, I mean, the budget was for, just round numbers, 300 million, and we're going to collect 400 million. Is that 100 million just sit in suspense until the next session, or is that able to be allocated?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, at the last meeting, we mentioned that the additional revenue that is currently being collected could be requested by the State Water Commission through budget section approval to be appropriated.
Hey, here we go again.
And that's a hard and yes, we can do that. So if
That is
if there's
legislative council's stand.
That's your stance? Well, I like you better than the state Supreme Court anyway, but, so for example, the Minot project, if we could get another 8 million, we could continue acquiring properties. Obviously, there's no money in the flood bucket if the 66.5 is requested in December, then that's cleaned out. But there is actual money in there because we're collecting more revenue than, we budgeted for, so they could bring that request at next budget section, or any other request is what you're saying then. So can we have them make a motion to do that, or?
Representative Nelson.
Mr. Chairman, I actually have a little history in this area. It's unlikely that, or the last time this occurred, let's put it that way, we were this close to another legislative session, and the decision was made at that point in time to put a bill draft together and fast track it through the legislative process. That way, I think it would meet the Supreme Court decisions and go through the regular legislative process. And yes, it does slow it down somewhat, but assuming that the bill draft passes, it would expedite that that reserve or that revenue that the Resource Trust Fund is gathering over the budget. That process has worked in the past.
Thank you. Any other comments? All right, let us move.
I would just say, why don't we work together to try to figure out if we've got additional revenue and we got projects that would fit all the criteria, let's figure out a way to get a bill together before the session comes together, fast track it and get the money flown to the places that need it.
Is that kind of what you're referring to, Mr. Nelson?
That's what the governor says. Yeah, I'm in total agreement.
Oh. Boy, that's a first. Okay.
Well, I mean, the Water Commission, we've got a couple of meetings between now and January, so I think we'll work with you, work with the Water Commission staff and the commissioners, and let's try to get a prioritized list put together that we could bring right away in January.
Okay, with that, any other discussion? Okay, let's try this again. Tammy, excuse me, where's that? Representative Carlson.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize for being late, but with the increase in oil prices, was the number mentioned that we anticipate to collect more than what we had originally projected when we left the session?
No, it was not.
We have that number?
We did not discuss it.
Because that would be an important part of your discussion, is that we're getting a pretty good handle this late now, knowing what that number would be, which may allow us to do things that we normally couldn't have done because of the increased revenue. So I think that's important to try and have a projection on that as you guys are trying to get that number leveled out.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think that, if you just run the simple math, I think it was closer to 100 million, wasn't it? 75, 80 million or something if you ran the numbers how they are now through June of next year when the, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of money. So there's gonna, I mean, it's at least a third higher than we were projecting, if I remember right, Chris, I think.
Go ahead.
Dave, did you want to, you have a number in the top of your head you want to throw out, or?
Yeah.
Saw you had a spreadsheet in your hand, I thought maybe.
Good morning, everyone. Good eyes, Governor. The budgeted revenue for the oil extraction tax was $267.1 million. We are currently $38 million ahead of what would have been projected. We are not ahead of that $267 million. In fact, our actual revenue at this point is $192. So technically, we are not ahead, and we won't be until a few more months by the end of the biennium. Yes, I expect we will be ahead. At this point, we have collected $192 million of $267. That is $38 million ahead of projected.
David, what is the income per month roughly? Knowing that it changes, but.
Yes, it does change. We have ranged from a low of 8.8 in July of 17 to the highest number is September 18. That was last month. We just collected 19 million. So you're right. It is a dramatic swing. Will we stay at that $19 million figure? I guess I'm not entirely certain, but that would be wonderful.
Representative Striley.
The answer is yes. So it's going to be closer to 100 million. Plus, we haven't even touched the $75 million line of credit. So, in reality, we've got a lot of money that we could deploy right now. Actually, if we had the demand on projects, which we do on some, not for that full amount, obviously, but.
Dave, thanks for having the numbers at hand. What, on the 192, was that through what month? The collected biennium to date number?
That is through September of 18.
Thank you.
My mistake, David.
We have 9 months left.
I took you off the agenda.
9 months left to collect the remaining 75. And last month we pulled in 19.
Correct.
My mistake, David. I took you off the agenda, and I should have probably left you on there.
Not a problem, sir.
You're sorry you're asked. Yeah, sure.
I will return the podium to.
Okay, Ms. Norgaard.
Great.
Podium is yours, Tammy.
Thank you. Chairman Schmidt, Governor, Lieutenant Governor, members of the committee and the commission. My name is Tammy Norgaard. I'm an attorney with the Vogel Law Firm. I am legal counsel to Garrison Diversion and have been working on the Red River Valley Water Supply Project. And just by way of background a little bit, we, in looking at a project this size, we did a lot of risk analysis, and I'm kind of the fun person that gets to think through the parade of horribles, worst case scenario, who's going to sue us and why. And really then we look at some strategic planning of, what can we do with the project today that will either put us in a better place if we get sued or avoid litigation altogether. And one aspect of what we had been discussing, I discussed with Chairman Schmidt, and he thought it would be helpful just to share some of these things with the group for your planning purposes. I'll start out by just talking about the Missouri River Drainage Basin. The Missouri River is 2,500 miles long. It's one of the longest rivers in the United States, drains 1/6 of the United States, which is 500,000 square miles, goes through 10 states, 2 Canadian provinces, and 25 tribes claim water rights on the Missouri River. And the reason that that's important, and that's a really important point, looking at the number of states involved, is because if there's ever a shortage, and we've had some low water situations on the Missouri River, but I don't necessarily mean shortage like the river's going dry, but shortage in terms of allocation of permits and who has what water under permit and who's going to be upset with new project development upstream. Those are really important things to think about for this group. And tribes, also a very important thing to understand, the rights of tribes and quantifying their water rights. Now, generally, states hold the water within the state in trust for the public. So I know you've had some presentations, I think Garland even presented at one of the last meetings talking about the permits that you hold on the Missouri River. But the states can only allocate the water within their state, and so you can identify how much water goes to whom within the state, but it's a big, long system, and if everybody's over-allocating their water with more permitted water, than the system would hold, you're going to inherently have conflicts. And one of the things a couple things have kind of arisen recently that you should be aware of. One is, the Bureau of Reclamations is talking about a project to bring a pipeline to Denver for a water supply, and that's a 90-inch pipeline. It's going to be a huge diversion of water off the system. And you know that Missouri's been suing North Dakota for years on the NAWS project, and they're arguing about depletion with the Red River Valley Water Supply Project. Even with the 20 CFS that we have as part of the Central North Dakota Water Supply Project, we've had objections from Missouri on depletion. And so with that, you can realize quickly that there's going to be a lot of possible litigation coming forward over the Missouri River. The fact that there's been past feuds, I think we can predict future feuds. So we have to look at how can we situate ourselves today or in the near future that's going to benefit us in the long run if we end up in a lawsuit. And just to give you some perspective, I put some numbers up there. The Missouri River system holds 72.3 million acre-feet of water. The current withdrawals upstream of the Garrison Dam are 6.6 million acre-feet, and those are withdrawals, those are not permits. I mean, North Dakota has no control over how much water the state of Montana permits to people. And so there could be you never know how much water people are permitting, but we can look at what the withdrawals are. And for our project, for Garrison Diversion, there's a state permit and an alternative permit that collectively have 1.2 million acre-feet of water. So just looking at a percentage of what's been committed, what's held by the system, it's just to give you perspective. The Central North Dakota project is only 14,000 acre-feet, so it's not even measurable on a river gauge, so it's really not that much, and we're still getting objections to it. Tribal rights, here's another thing that's come up recently. In June, the state of Montana reached a settlement with the Blackfeet tribe in Montana, and this tribe has been working for 30 years to quantify their water rights. And the way tribal water rights work is it's recognized that the tribes have this sovereign water right. They were here first. They have the right to as much water as it's going to take for their needs on the reservations, for their communities. And what was negotiated over this 30-year period with Montana and with the federal government is a payment of $470 million to the tribe, and some of this is overtime in terms of grants for irrigation and water system improvements, but they reserved 800,000 acre-feet of water for the tribe per year. So thinking back to that 72 million acre-feet a year in the whole system, here we have 800,000 acre-feet that's suddenly been committed to one tribe in Montana. There's other tribes up and down the system that are doing the same. There's 25 tribes up and down the Missouri River system. And I'm pointing this out just to identify that there are going to be other entities that are claiming water rights on the river, and as they have sovereign rights and the available water to be permitted and used kind of ends up getting condensed a little bit, there could be conflict. And so the question is, what happens in these cases of a shortage? So it's different if you're in an eastern system or a western system. Eastern water law is a riparian system. Everybody kind of shares. If you're on the river, you get a share of that water. Okay, we are not under Eastern water law. We're under Western water law, which is prior appropriation, and that's first in time, first in right. So those people with permits from the 50s and 60s have a guaranteed water right. If I get a new permit for an ethanol plant today, I know that my permit is subject to making sure everybody else gets their water first, and I could have some jeopardy. So if you have a conflict in a system that's solely prior appropriation or solely riparian, it's a little easier to predict how this is going to get worked out. But with the Missouri River, it crosses states that have both systems, so it just makes it more complicated when you have to figure out who gets what water when there's different kinds of water law. So the point being, just because we have a 1.2 million acre-foot permit from 1967 for the state of North Dakota for development in eastern North Dakota, doesn't really mean we get that water, because that's subject to later on what happens with the system and what water is actually available. If there's litigation, it could be challenged. So,
if I may,
Chairman Schmidt?
Going back to your tribal discussion.
Yes.
Do you know how many acre-feet the tribes in North Dakota are asking for from the Missouri River?
I will say that depends. And there had been some indications with Standing Rock. I know that they'd entered into some preliminary negotiations for quantification of their water rights. But in conversations that and then after DAPL, things changed, and the conversations that I've had with Standing Rock, since then, they've said that's kind of off the table, and they're saying they weren't quantifying their water rights. Maybe that's changed since I talked to them last, but I don't think they've committed to any.
Okay, with respect to Standing Rock, since it's in Senator Scheibele in my district, and it's on the Missouri River, is that appropriation of water based on future needs or current needs? And if it's based on future needs, how do you justify that?
It takes 30 years to figure that out through negotiations is probably the best answer. It's very difficult. It's reasonable needs of the tribe, and I can't tell you exactly the factors that go in or how far that you'd look for, but it's reasonably foreseeable needs of the tribes. I mean, I don't think the tribe could say we're going to start this big commercial, we're going to pump water to the Bakken from Standing Rock. Maybe that's not reasonable, but
One last comment on that, but the tribal chairman told me that they were looking for water rights for the 7th generation. That seems to be quite a ways in the future.
it is, but that wouldn't surprise me.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Tammy, on the Montana settlement of the $470 million?
Yes.
Who were the negotiating parties on that? Was that the federal government or federal and state or?
Federal government, state government, and the tribes, and Montana ended up agreeing to pay $49 million of that 470.
But who got to say yes to the withdrawal, the size of the withdrawal? Was that combination, the feds and the state?
Right.
That agreed to that?
Yes. So one option, and probably the preferred option in terms of if you have control over the outcome, is to have a compact on a river. And I think, if you even think about just that 30 years to get the one agreement in Montana, think about trying to negotiate with 2 Canadian provinces, 10 states, and 25 tribes to compact the Missouri River. It would be a very difficult undertaking. But there are a number of river systems that have been compacted. Typically, they'll set up apportionment per state. It doesn't tell you what to do with it. They'll say North Dakota gets X amount. You decide how you're going to appropriate that among your users, but it would be an apportionment that would go to North Dakota. Or you could establish some regional bodies that would be in charge of allocating water depending on need. There's been some recent demands. You always hear about desires to compact the Missouri River. I don't know if they're going anywhere, but you hear that once in a while. In general, I think this is recognized as the best option if you want to control the outcome. The second option is congressional apportionment, where Congress decides who gets what water. And that's only happened twice. In one of those situations, the states actually came forward and said, well, we could probably live with this plan, and they submitted it to Congress, and Congress appropriated it. So while it's there as an option, it's probably not something that happens terribly often. The most likely scenario, and the one you see frequently is, well, not frequently, but whenever there's state versus state water disputes, is litigation. And the standard, and this is the part where you have to think of what can we do today to make sure that we're in a better position if we get sued in 20 years. And the standard that the Supreme Court uses is equitable apportionment. And I'll point out that when it's a state-by-state piece of litigation over water rights, the original jurisdiction is the Supreme Court. You go right to the U.S. Supreme Court. You don't start in district court in North Dakota and hope you have a friendly judge. This just goes right to the U.S. Supreme Court. So it typically arises when a downstream state says, hey, that use that you're planning upstream is going to affect me, and they have to show that there's a real and substantial injury downstream to their rights. And I mean, even like you're familiar with water appropriation, aquifer appropriation, senior water right holders, we're fairly high on the system. So how much water do we have to let flow by just in case people downstream decide to use 100% of their water rights? So there's, many things that could lead to litigation, and if they say, well, we have this much permitted and this much need, even though we're not using it now, it's a wet cycle, it's a dry cycle, we don't want you to start this project further north because it's going to take the water off the system, not in perpetuity, but annually. So if the lower state is able to establish that they have a real and substantial injury, then the burden shifts to the upstream state to show that they're going to have significant impacts. And so they look at a variety of things, and these are the things that I just want you to think about. In terms of water funding, water project development, what kind of things we can do in North Dakota to make sure that we put ourselves in the best possible position to get more water if there's ever an equitable apportionment lawsuit. And you want to put the most water you can to beneficial use. And so beneficial use is municipal uses, irrigation, hydropower is part of this. There's also going to be arguments about navigation when a judge is looking at North Dakota versus Missouri or Colorado or what have you. It's going to be, well, let's balance the interests. Let's balance the harms. Who's harmed, how much, who benefits, and how much. And the key to take away from today is that the court will not look at long-term plans. Oh, you had a plan to do this and you have a permit? Great. They're going to look at who you're serving. How many people are you serving? What water are you putting to beneficial use? And that's going to get weighed more heavily because the court's not going to take that water away from a community that's using the water, saying, yeah, but somebody over there has a plan that they want to develop something in the next 10 years. They'll look at waste, if you're wasting water. If you have conservation plans, they'll look at historic uses of water, the established uses that you've been putting water to. They'll look at your return flows, so the court will be looking at, sure, we take a lot of water out, but then we return it back to the system. Or is it water that's being taken out for oil and gas purposes and used and not returned to the system? You know, those kind of factors come into play. And there's generally a duty to conserve. But I think that, that these are all factors that should make you think about trying to put the most water to beneficial use that you can. And we hear budget concerns today. You've also heard about needs for projects and delays that could happen. But if you end up delaying these things too long, you've got some real water needs for NAWS. NAWS put the water to use for NAWS, for Southwest, for the Red River Valley, for WAS. And I think Commissioner Owen and Representative Zubke could tell you too that there's some pipelines on WAS right now where there's so many oil companies that are trying to buy the water that they're fully committed already in some areas where, domestic needs are always first. But there's industrial demand where, there could be more water that's being provided to the oil industry too. And so when looking at this, you want to make sure that you're putting the most water to beneficial use that you possibly can, because if there is a claim sometime, you want to be in the camp that says, here's the amount we're using, and it's not just we have plans to be able to use this. And the fact that you have a permit in hand isn't necessarily going to mean that that water is reserved for you. Okay. Any questions?
Commissioner Anderson.
What is the perspective, or is there another example of a supplemental water supply as a use, and how does that rank in what you were just saying out of usage of water? If you're not in a time where you're utilizing a supplemental water supply, but you've built all the infrastructure to do so, do you have any opinion or perspective on what a Supreme Court would look at for that particular use?
Chairman Schmidt and Commissioner Anderson, I think you'd be in a very strong position because we have a permit. We have put the permit to conditional use or to beneficial use. In the case of the supplemental water supply, while it is supplemental, there will be water flowing through it. We're hoping to have some industrial users in your area and along the pipeline. So I think that once you've developed that infrastructure, then your conditional permit is a permit the water's been put to beneficial use, and I think that amount would be protected. It would be hard for somebody to say, oh, you're not using it all the time, so we're going to take it away from you. I don't think they'd take it away from you.
Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tammy, I know you're not on the Supreme Court, but for your perspective from a states' rights perspective, what value does a state have or does it have any value in the taking, for example, of the land for Lake Sakakawea and the storage of areas of water storage in the Missouri River system? Does that enter into the decision that the courts make as far as an appropriation?
Chairman Schmidt and Representative Nelson, I would say I sure hope so. And if you look back to the Pick-Sloan plan, one of the sticking points in this is the Pick-Sloan plan was developed because Missouri was getting flooded repeatedly, downstream states. So we put this plan in place to put these dams in, keep the water back. The southern states got their flood control. We supposedly got this water supply and all this water available for irrigation and municipal water supply. And now we're getting fought tooth and nail. Like on this project, even for 20 CFS in Missouri, is sending letters in saying, hey, you shouldn't take that. This needs to be studied more and check the depletion of something that's not even measurable on the system. So in terms of state rights, the Pick-Sloan plan would be front and center in arguing anything on state rights if there was a state-to-state conflict, basically identifying that we have the right to that water. Congress said that we have the right to develop this water behind Garrison Dam, and we have the permits, and yet we still have to get through all these other hurdles when people are suing us for other things like NEPA. You didn't look at X, Y, and Z under NEPA. And that's part of the reason on the Red River Valley, we're just trying to avoid the federal trigger so we don't have that long-term piece of litigation with the state project.
If I could, Mr. Chairman. Tammy, would it be prudent for the state to put together a ledger as to what the cost of the dam has been for property owners and the state of North Dakota with lost commercial revenue over the period of, well, I think the dam has been, it was in 1959, was that when it was flooded? In my lifetime, anyway. And would that be helpful for in the process that the state would prepare some type of a document that would show that cost?
And Chairman Schmidt, Representative Nelson, I think that would be a great piece of information to have if you're making arguments and negotiating. I mean, one of the things, we've been talking to Manitoba about treatment issues. We're hoping to set something up with Missouri to talk about trying to avoid another round of litigation, and they're still suing on NAWS, but it would be relevant. I think it would be something to use in negotiations. It helps tell the story a little bit better.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Tammy? Seeing none, thank you very kindly, ma'am.
Thank you.
Let us move on to our next presentation. Gary's now with us, so I believe Keith Weston will make the presentation. And just for a little bit of background for the State Water Commission members, the last Water Topics meeting we had, I asked Gary to make a presentation on the effort in the Red River Basin itself. And the effort was funded primarily by USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service to the tune of $12 million. And again, it was a watershed management planning within the basin and how it was coordinated. And I thought it would be of value to have Mr. Weston review for us as we sit with the commission and us to give us a little bit of update and a little bit more background, if you would, Mr. Weston, as to what's happening in those separate basins or watersheds within the basin.
Thank you, Chairman Schmidt and committee members. I will give you a very quick update. Also, I'm going to ask Greg Thielman from Houston to give a specific report on one of those projects. And then Mr. Chad Engels will wrap it up with conclusion as how we keep moving forward with water management in the Red River Basin. I'll give you a quick background. First of all, Co-Chairman Thompson regrets that he can't be here. He sends his greetings, but he asked me to fill in for him this morning. Again, my name's Keith Weston. I'm the Executive Director of the Red River Retention Authority, located here in Fargo. Just some quick historical items, and I won't take much time at all, but the Joint Board is one of the two parent organizations that makes up the Retention Authority. Of course, the Joint Board was formed back in 1979 and is made up of 14 water resource districts in 11 counties in the basin. The Joint Board is a key funding mechanism for water resource management in the basin, as well as the state and federal governments. And so you can see here, and this was a slide I think we shared with you one other time, but there is a mill levy that's put on those areas in the Red River Basin that help fund water resource projects. The Retention Authority itself was made up, or is made through a joint powers agreement between the states of Minnesota and North Dakota. That was done back in May of 2010 and basically happened as a result of the 2009 flooding, which you've seen plenty of and heard plenty of the last 2 days. The purpose was to ensure cooperation and joint coordination of retention projects throughout the valley. And again, it's made up of 14 water resource districts here in our state and 8 in Minnesota. Originally, RCPP, which is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, the Retention Authority applied for that funding. We asked for 20 million, we got 12 million. The Retention Authority chose to use those dollars that they did receive to do watershed planning, comprehensive watershed planning. We are in the process now of finishing those plans. Those plans need to be done by May of 2020. There is an option of a one-year extension for extenuating circumstances, but it's still the intent of the authority to finish that planning up in 2020. There currently are actually only 19 watershed projects still ongoing in the basin. There's 7 here in North Dakota and 12 across the river in Minnesota. I think in general I could say that North Dakota watershed planning is ahead of the Minnesota watersheds. Part of that was just because of the agreements that were signed with USDA, but the sponsors, those water resource districts, have done a good job of contacting and contracting with consultants to do the watershed planning. And I believe you have an additional handout, that this document, and that gives you a little bit larger map of those watershed areas, and also gives you some background on the 7 watershed projects that are currently ongoing in North Dakota. So with that, I want to invite Greg Thielman to come up and talk about one of those particular projects as well, and then Chad Engels with Moore Engineering will do a conclusion.
Keith, if I may, before you do that, what criteria did you use to select the watersheds that you were going to fund in order to develop those plans?
Those plans, the Retention Authority Board went through not a real detailed vetting process, I guess, if you will. They asked the individual, the eligible watershed districts and water resource districts, which watersheds they wanted to promote and move into this funding mechanism and this prioritization. So there was originally 22 projects. Several have dropped out. Some have started planning and ceased planning, but all but 2 of those were initially approved for funding. They set the limit of funding for $500,000 per watershed, the authority did.
Are there any in North Dakota that wanted to develop a watershed plan but were not funded?
No, not at this time. I think there's some others out there, but any time with a federal program, and it was new at that time, I think there was more of a let's wait and see how this works. I think we're getting to where others will, at some point in the future, utilize this planning process.
My thoughts are is perhaps that we could fund one of those watershed planning efforts as opposed to the federal government.
Yes, that's certainly, if the word's out there, that would be certainly an option.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Schmidt, Governor, Lieutenant Governor, committee members, and commissioners. My name is Greg Thielman. I'm with Houston Engineering, and we're involved in a number of the watershed planning efforts on both sides of the river. And what I'm going to talk about here is the north branch of the Park River. And this watershed is located in the northeast portion of North Dakota and includes portions of Cavalier, Pembina, and Walsh counties. It's fairly typical of watersheds within the Red River Basin, where you have a steep upper portion of the watershed. It transitions down into what used to be Glacial Lake Agassiz, and then it's really flat, and a lot of the channels don't have the capacity to handle the water that comes upon them. There's a long history of planning efforts on the north branch of the Park River going back to, in 2011, the NRCS did complete a preliminary watershed assessment. One of the big impetuses behind the watershed plan for this particular watershed was a large rainfall event in 2013 that caused considerable flood damage throughout the watershed. And at that point, the Pembina and the Walsh County boards got together and formed a joint board to look at solutions for those flood problems. And they actually initiated a pre-RCPP effort that was funded by state and local dollars to look at solutions within that watershed. When the RCPP program came along, that project was transitioned into the RCPP program and was approved for that. As part of that project, part of the initial effort was to identify the problems. Obviously, agricultural impacts was a big part of that, particularly in the lower portion of the watershed, where there's considerable overland flow. There's also infrastructure damage, community impacts. The community of Crystal receives considerable flood damage during heavy runoff events. There were some primary objectives that were determined, reducing cropland flood damages for a 10-year rainfall event. This is pretty typical of ag drainage, is to try to achieve protection for that 10-year event. Increase flood resiliency to public and private infrastructure. Look at solutions for the community of Crystal where they could get 100-year flood protection, and maintain or reduce flows downstream of the North Branch. The North Branch does flow into the Park River, which flows through Grafton and ultimately enters into the Red River, so there is a desire to try to reduce flood damages in those areas as well. There's been 2 meetings held with strong public attendance. One was pre-RCP and the other was post-RCPP. Right now we're in the alternative development stage. There is a formal planning effort that needs to be followed. The alternatives range from no action, levees, riparian corridors, retention, drainage, floodplain easements. So all of these options are being evaluated as part of these RCPP programs. And they'll ultimately be evaluated and a preferred alternative will be identified. So where are we at now? Most of the projects are in the develop and analyze alternatives. Like I said earlier, ultimately they'll identify that preferred alternative. And then it comes down to implementation. Really, these programs are funded through the assessment, but ultimately we'll need to find funding to implement whatever solutions come out of that. Some potential sources would include the federal government through the NRCS, State Water Commission, the Red River Joint Board, local, others. Right now, through the planning effort, it's been a combination of federal funds, state funds, joint board funds, and then also local funds. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Chad.
A question for you, if I may.
Sure.
So, okay, so you're going to develop this plan. Is it going to sit on the shelf and do nothing, or what's your implementation process to do something with it?
Well, I think ultimately it's going to be up to the watersheds to come up with a solution, working with the state. You know, and if it does meet the federal requirement, there's potential there for federal dollars. But especially in the case of the North Branch of the Park River, there's a strong desire to implement a solution up there. Obviously, funding will be a critical part of that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Governor, Chairman Schmidt, and members of the committee. My name is Chad Ingalls. I'm a consulting engineer with Moore Engineering. I've been working with North Dakota Water Resource Districts for most of my career, and I can tell you very much that the North Dakota Water Resource Districts do appreciate your involvement in their mission. Their mission is critical. What they do is they implement flood risk reduction and watershed projects at the local level. And in order to do that, they require your support. They require the state of North Dakota to basically partner with them. We've had great champions in the legislature, and as we do today, and we want to see the partnership continue, obviously. So thank you for this opportunity to once again hold a place on your agenda. I'm just going to put a bow tie on this presentation, talk about water management issues in general, tying in with what you've heard already regarding the RCPP. Back in the 1960s, in the decade before and the decade after, there was a fairly aggressive push by the federal government through the SCS implement flood control impoundments and distributed storage in the Red River Basin and in many parts of the United States. In the Red River Basin, there was approximately 50 watershed impoundments constructed on the North Dakota side in that era. And following that era, the North Dakota water resource districts in the Red River Basin became quite aggressive as well with the development of additional impoundments. Local water resource districts have stepped to the table to not only maintain the federal projects, because as you know, when those federal projects are built, they're handed over to the locals to maintain and operate. So they've been taking care of those with the state's help and support, of course. But they've also constructed numerous new impoundments to store additional floodwaters. And over 100,000 acre-feet of storage has been constructed with the leadership of water resource districts in the Red River Basin. And so that's quite a feat. The most recent of which is the Upper Maple River Dam, located not too far from Colgate, North Dakota, in that Hope area, a 7,000 acre impoundment. And so a lot's been done, but a lot needs to happen as well. So while these impoundments were very successful and worthwhile, flood control does remain an unfinished venture. As you saw, I guess, in all your presentations today, and I've been hearing about for quite some time, with the recent flooding in 2009, 10, and 11, and 13, it has shown us that rural cities, roads, ag lands still face significant repetitive flood damage costs and impacts to quality of life. And the water resource districts do a good job of filling that role. A lot of times it's, they do work with the larger urban communities as well, but water resource districts fill that role of looking out for those rural, smaller communities, the smaller cities, the agricultural areas. And so that's an important mission that they have. Yes, Chairman Schmidt.
Chad, with respect to the dams that are being built by water resource districts, and you mentioned a number of them, what's their hazard classification of those dams?
Primarily, they're a moderate hazard. We're not doing too many that are significant.
Okay, in the process of doing those, with regards to the retention area below those dams, there's been, in some cases, development in that retention area, which has increased the hazard classification from medium to high. And we had that just recently. And you notice that we had legislation that said we will no longer participate, the state will, in funding the increase in hazard classification. Are you running into any of that inundation development that changes that classification at all?
No, actually, I have not had that experience in my career, or really the list of impoundments that I have here on this particular slide, the six projects that you see at the bottom. I can tell you the Beaver Creek Dam, T-180, Dead Cold Creek, Upper Maple, Maple River Dam, those particular projects, there's very little development, or hardly any that I've been aware of. Obviously, Bald Hill Dam is right above Valley City, so there's obviously some development down there.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so moving along, additional retention is needed. What we're doing is consistent with other goals in the basin. You're going to hear from the Red River Basin Commission this afternoon. They're going to talk a little bit about the long-term flood solutions, and one of the challenges that they have is for local water resource districts, watershed districts on the Minnesota side, is a 20% flow reduction on the Red River. And building these impoundments, of course, not only provides significant local benefits, but over time, as they're built, there's a cumulative benefit to the Red River main stem. And if you get enough of them on the ground, we have shown through studies that while a 20% flow reduction is quite aggressive, it is possible. I want to move on, though, to how retention kind of fits into the overall scheme of the flood risk reduction strategy. And so, to start with, water management projects are scalable, and they do work together. You know, you've heard a lot about diversions this morning and levees. We saw drainage yesterday and hearing about retention right now. All of those projects, they really do work together in a strategy to reduce the flood risk for various needs. And when we talk about levees and diversions, we're talking typically about projects that are built to protect a specific area or community from a very large flood event, and they serve that role. Drainage, like we saw yesterday, are for those nuisance summer rains, but rains that are impactful to crops and crop production. And so those are flood risk reduction projects as well, of a different scale. And then we have the impoundments. And impoundments are unique in that they not only have local benefits, but they have the regional benefits as well that I've just discussed. And impoundments, as we build more and more impoundments over time, all that will do is make the existing diversions that are constructed, the existing levee projects that are on the ground, that much more robust, because it's making the oncoming flood that much smaller. You understand that? So what's already in place becomes that much more robust. It protects to a higher flood event. All right, so to build these distributed storage projects, we've learned a number of things. First of all, you need to have local support. You're not going to put a project in someone's backyard unless there's a local benefit to that community. I can tell you from firsthand experience, if we go into a local community and say, we need to put a project here for the benefit of the Red River main stem, you're not going to go very far. So the primary benefits are local, but there are secondary cumulative benefits on the red, as I talked about. And so distributed storage is really something that the water resource districts take seriously, and the RCPP planning is just the latest example of that. So, in summary, when we complete the RCPP planning, in about a 2-year period, we're going to have a number of new projects that are going to be shovel-ready, most of which will be impoundments. There will be some other types of projects that come out of the RCPP planning. There may be some levee projects for some communities or some other types of projects. But primarily, we're looking at impoundments. In the past, when the funding has been there, the State Water Commission cost share program for water resource districts in constructing impoundments has been 60%. If there's a federal partner, 50%. But our timeline is looking something in the order of about 2 years from now is when you're going to start seeing these projects. We'll have to see how many there is and kind of take a measurement of what the request will be. That's kind of the timeline.
If I may, another antique question.
Sure.
Years ago, Senator Dorgan had a $5.3 million earmark to EERC to put together the infamous waffle plan.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that that during that time frame there was a lot of objection to that idea, but the $5.3 million was spent. In your experience, has any of that effort been used?
No. The waffle plan had some challenges.
Yes.
There was a practical challenge with it in terms of implementation. In order to hold water on purpose, you have to construct to dam safety standards. And to hold water behind a road is of unknown construction methods or materials is not allowable in any state that I'm aware of. And so when it would have come time to acquire a permit, it wasn't going to happen unless you were to completely reconstruct roads to dam standards, and that's just not feasible. The second challenge with it is the modeling had some issues, and that was reviewed by the water resource districts and confirmed by the state engineer at the time. And so once the claims were debunked, so to speak, it kind of disappeared.
Okay, just for total transparency, my name was on those $5.3 million of payments to EERC. Don't look at me like that, Representative Carlson.
I apologize to be the bearer of bad news.
That's quite all right. All right, with that, folks, let's take our lunch break. Senator Kroon, sorry.
Thank you, Chairman Schmidt. Just a quick question. 18 months shovel-ready projects. Do any of these reduction projects lessen the flow in Grand Forks?
Many of them will, depending upon where they're located. So if there are projects, obviously, in the northern part of the Red River Basin downstream, obviously, those will not. If there are projects in the southern portion or upstream of Grand Forks, and they're located in an area where it times with the peak at Grand Forks, they definitely will. We've studied a number of small impoundments that do have a measurable change on the peak at both Grand Forks and Fargo. It takes a number of them for it to be a significant change, but a change nonetheless.
Mr. Chairman, the question being is, we took a look yesterday, we looked at all the drainage areas, all the areas that need snagging and clearing to run our water through the process. Also, the different modeling that's taken place in Plan A and Plan B. As we go through this, our concern gets higher and higher, what's going to take place downstream. The storage capacity is being reduced. Now, hopefully this would help, but when you take a look at this, we are not at this point being reduced in any way, shape, or form of the level of our floods. Actually, the potential on a normal flood situation is going to be higher. So we have to take that into consideration as we go through this process and all the modeling and all the drainage that takes place, the conversion of the two rivers at that point from Minnesota. I'm starting to be a bit concerned at this point that it's not going to be a benefit to Grand Forks. So we want to make dang sure that that takes place.
Are you speaking to the drainage projects and the interaction with flooding?
All of the things that we've been discussing over the last day and a half contribute to my concern. And I know it's our city engineer's concern and our mayor's concern as well. It's not detrimental at this point, but if we keep changing and adding, and it will be, and then there's going to be another a large amount that's going to have to take place as far as flood protection goes too. So just to keep that in perspective.
Mr. Chairman, if I could address that, that's a very valid point, and a great comment. You're right, absolutely right. All water resource district facilities, no matter what they are, need to be well thought out in terms of downstream impacts. The design, I can tell you firsthand that the design of legal assessment drains, for example, which are often criticized as a contributor to flooding, those projects are carefully thought out, and we do analyze the downstream impacts for an array of flow events. They are designed for the smaller events that are typically your non-flood events to remove, again, those nuisance rains from the fields. But they're also designed to not worsen downstream flooding. And how we accomplish that is through proper culvert sizing and through proper berm elevations adjacent to the channel. And we provide what's a breakout area upstream of the roads on the drains that we design. When that drain exceeds that 10-year, 24-hour rain event, which isn't a large rain event, but it's significant, the excess flows spill out of the drain because it no longer has the capacity to convey that flow and goes into floodplain storage as it would have pre-project condition. And so that's how we in our design balance the low flow benefits that we're looking for, the smaller flood benefits, with not having an impact on the larger events. And so that is, I can assure you, that is looked at carefully. The same thing with dams. You could hold water back from a dam and release it so that it does not time well in the watershed. That has to be understood as well when you construct a project. So yes,
No,
very important.
We're not opposed. Everybody needs water protection and drainage and those issues. But being one of the first ones to have a pretty good flood protection project, has to be taken into consideration as you develop the rest of our flood protection projects and drainage projects that take place in the whole valley, is just my point.
Representative Mitskog.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is probably a question more for Mr. Weston. If I could just lean on him for a moment. I'm just curious about the comprehensive discussions. Have they occurred, now revisiting and the new plan, proposed plan for the diversion? Have there been, I know down in our area, there's been discussion about impoundments and distributed storage. And so was that part of the current discussions and revisions to the plan about the potential for impoundment down in the southern part of the valley?
Yes, Representative Mitskog. As an example, the one watershed that's down on your end of the basin, the north branch of Antelope Creek, as they go through that planning process, they will look at the local needs, as Mr. Engels talked about. You need to have a local benefit. You need to have something that needs to be fixed. And so North Branch Antelope Creek was identified by the Richland Water Resource District, but they will look at that project and they will look at how it could or may impact what's downstream, which of course is the FM area. And so that will be addressed to somewhat a limited amount, but how it's, if there are retention alternatives developed in that plan, they will look at how they impact downstream. Absolutely. And I don't know if I've addressed your question totally, but
Partially, I guess. So if they have those discussions, but are they on a higher level with multiple groups and like the diversion authority about the positive?
with the actual diversion authority, I do not believe so. And unfortunately, the representative for the Richland board, I don't see here. But Jason's going to bail me out, it looks like.
All right. Yes, Representative Mitskog. So during the governor's task force.
Jason, would you please state your name for the record?
Jason Benson, the Cass County engineer. During the governor's task force, that was a component that we looked at in depth, was upstream storage. And throughout that process, it's been agreed that it's a great benefit for the region to have storage, as has been discussed. However, when we look at FEMA certification for a flood control project, FEMA won't certify multiple upstream impoundments as a certified project for flood, especially getting people out of flood insurance. The Diversion Authority has set aside $25 million for upstream retention projects, and there have been a few projects on the Minnesota side that have applied for that. We will continue to support upstream, but it's not an integral part of the diversion project and flood control. Again, we'll look at any projects that bring a request for that $25 million.
So, Jason, to be clear, the 25 that has been set aside several years ago, have there been any requests for those dollars to date?
Governor, at this time, there have been a few requests, primarily on the Minnesota side, I believe on Wolverton Creek, and one project down in Willikin County.
Okay, with that, thank you much. I do not see any further questions. Oh, Governor, go.
Representative Nelson, did you have one too?
Representative Nelson, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is probably for Chad. I've been trying to segue back into this, and within this discussion, I think it's appropriate to do so. The upstream discussion earlier this morning that Mayor Williams was part of talked about flowage easements. I'm not real familiar with flowage easements. I'd like to, I know that it's in process as far as what the value of a flowage easement is. I'd like to know what, how it practically works. Do they only, are they only paid out when there's overland flooding, or is it an annual easement, or and give me a ballpark.
Sure.
What as an ag producer, what to expect?
Sure. Well, the flowage easements that we've utilized for the construction of rural impoundments has been a one-time payment for a permanent easement to store water behind a dam. The picture that you see up on the screen is a picture of the Upper Maple River Dam. And on the left side is the downstream of the dam, and on the right side is the area upstream of the dam. So the lands on the right side are still owned by the private landowner. It's their property to continue to graze or have livestock in or farm at their own risk. But in this case, the Water Resource District acquired a permanent easement, one-time payment. Now, what they do is they utilize an appraiser to determine that value. And the value can range greatly from the actual value of the land if you were to sell it fee simple, all the way to something perhaps 20% of the land value, depending upon elevation behind the dam and depending upon land use. And typically, the lands that are lower in elevation, closer to the stream, are your pasture-type lands, and the lands that are higher in elevation are your cultivated lands. And so the appraiser will look at both land use and elevation. Obviously, the lower you are in the pool in elevation, the more frequently it's flooded and the more impact, and so the higher the easement should be. And the higher you are in elevation, the less frequently that land will get wet, and therefore the smaller the dollar amount for the permanent easement.
Okay, so, Mr. Chairman, just one follow-up. So, Chad, in the discussion about with the Fargo diversion, though, that's generally it's agricultural, it's prime agricultural land we're talking, is it not?
Yes.
Does a flowage easement, would that change an ag producer's ability to insure that crop with crop insurance, for example?
I can't speak to the FM diversion project and their arrangements because I'm not involved in what they're doing. But I can tell you that in our rural impoundments, that is a factor, and that is accounted for in those values. Now, on the rural impoundments, if that ag land is flooded due to the impoundment, they're not eligible for crop insurance under our arrangement, again, for the rural dams. If their ag land floods because it would have anyway, whether or not the impoundment was there, then they still do qualify for crop insurance. So it's really the difference. The difference is if water backed up onto their land from the dam, or if it was something that would have happened anyway, like water backing up behind a road that happened to be upstream of the dam but still in the pool area. So that's the distinction there. With regards to the diversion.
And I can try to answer that, and I've got Eric Dodds here with A2S, our program manager, that could probably address it in more detail. But yes, we have an appraiser right now doing an actual national study on what the appropriate flowage easement would be for the retention area of the FM diversion, because it varies quite a bit. I mean, primarily it's agriculture, but there is developmental possibilities for that land in the future, and so the flowage easement obviously is not going to be the same as what was out in the Upper Maple River Dam. So that's one aspect of that, and as I mentioned before, we're just wrapping up phase 1 of that. We have NDSU partnering in phase 2, and that will be starting shortly. And then as far as crop loss in the summer, we will be insuring that, the diversion board itself, because my understanding is that is not available for federal crop insurance. So I don't know.
And just to follow,
Eric has any
one other question that keeps coming up is, how voluntary is the participation in the flowage easement process? Or is it mandated?
It will have to be, some of this property will have several feet of water on it during an event. Some will just have a few inches, and so, I mean, as you get further out, the water spreads out, and of course it depends on, you know, your maximum event versus, you know, a more modest event. So those are all things that we are, you know, as I said, contracting with a national firm to really get a good idea of what what the fair price for that flowage easement will be, because we know it will not be the same as some of these other retention projects. You bet.
Okay, Governor, I'll give you the last word, and then we'll leave for lunch.
Okay, comment and a question, so gentlemen, stick around for the question. On the comment on the distributed storage, there's a lot of experience in this room. People know that they've been pursuing distributed storage in Red River Valley for a lifetime and beyond. If you go back to the earliest history of Fargo, Fargo had a disadvantage. It didn't have any way, it didn't have a place to store water for hydro. That's why people wanted to store water initially for hydropower, whether it was for mills or for generating electricity. Sioux Falls had all the mills. They had a competitive advantage. If you look at the names of the historic towns in Minnesota, Thief River Falls, Red River Falls, Pelican Rapids, Fergus Falls, I mean, these were all places that had topography that allowed for hydro generation. So in the earliest days of Fargo, when they said go upstream and find the first place we can put either a mill or a power plant, on the old maps, the Otter Tail is listed as the Red River. They went upstream on the Red, and they ended up in Fergus Falls, and that's why Otter Tail Power is headquartered initially in Fergus Falls because of that. So when we try to solve the size floods we have in the Red River Valley with storage, you got to get to the upper reaches of the basin. You know, if you go on the North Dakota side, the biggest storage that would protect this area is Bald Hill Dam in Valley City. And so, you know, as I said earlier, it's a piece of the puzzle, needs to be continued to be pursued, but it's not an end-all solution that's going to cover the size of events that we have today. It's just not going to happen, and so we need to keep we need to keep looking at it and seeing how all those things relate together. In terms of the question I have, given that we've got this flat topography, some of the hydrology work that influences all of our spending on these projects is based on projected flows. And there was on the first part of the slide that said they're spending $138,000 annually, you know, for USGS stream gauge funding. I've just had some questions. I don't know if it's for Keith or Greg or who's wants to take this one, Chad, somebody, but you know, when we take a look at spending $138,000 versus the billions we're talking about, and the data is what drives the decision, I'm wondering if we're collecting enough data. Are there advancements in stream gauge technology? Should we have more data points? How do we effectively collect data on ground that sometimes only has water on it every 10 years, but during a big flood event, a lot of water's moving over that flat ground? So just what's the state of the art on data collection, and are we investing enough?
Well, there is a commitment on both the state and local level as well as the federal level to maintain stream gauges. And one of the things with the stream gauges, you're always starting at day one, you know, you're collecting data for future analysis, because a lot of times you're looking at statistics when you're analyzing your 100-year flood and so on. But as part of the Fargo-Moorhead Diversion Project, there have been some additional locations identified for gauges that will aid in the operation of the project. And I know the watersheds and the state continue to work with the USGS in maintaining a network that they feel is needed to adequately monitor things within the various watersheds in the Red River Valley.
Has there ever been an effort, either through the Red River Joint Water Resource District or the Red River Basin, to actually figure out across all these different entities? Because at one point I had seen that if you counted the local townships, there's over 1,400 entities between here and Lake Winnipeg that try to manage water in the Red River Basin. Have we ever said, what's the total budget on stream gauge collection across that whole group? And is there any collaborative effort across the whole group to figure out, are we investing enough in the data collection?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you at this moment, the Red River Joint Water Resource District is putting about $140,000 a year annually into the USGS data collection system. The Minnesota Red River Watershed Board, which is the North Dakota Joint Board equivalent, is doing about the same. In addition, I think there's communities, Grand Forks, Fargo, are also supplementing the USGS budget for the collection of data as well. Those are the primary entities that are investing in data collection. I'm not aware of other organizations doing that. The data, you're right, the data is critical. It's critical to the engineers so that we can properly design projects, whether it's a diversion or an impoundment. You do struggle when you don't have the data. It's always nice to have a USGS gauge on the stream or river that you're looking to build a project on. I almost want to say it's critical, but there are other means to estimate flows, of course, but having that gauge is very helpful and to getting the right answer, obviously. So yeah, it's important. It's being invested in. Do we need more? Perhaps. After 2009 and 11, we identified areas where additional gauging was needed, and those gauges were put in place. It was maybe a half a dozen at that time. I have not been involved in any discussions recently where we've had, talk about needing more, but it's always kind of on the radar in the background.
Okay, well, I'll just conclude by saying that under our new Water Commission, if any of the groups that are here today are present, the joint boards, the Red River Basin, wanted to come forward with a proposal on how to build out a better network for data collection, we'd be very interested in hearing it, because we can spend years listing to hundreds of millions of dollars of requests, and nobody comes and says, hey, we want 20 grand for better data. And so I would just encourage people to think about that, because if you take a look at your $138,000 budget relative to what we're spending, it seems like we're not doing enough on the data collection. And then the last comment back on the storage piece, which was mentioned by Chad and others, but if we're going to do storage requires management, which requires governance, which requires humans. Anybody that lived in Bismarck in 2011 understands there's a lot of upstream storage. More upstream storage on the Missouri than we'll ever even could conceive of on the Red River, and yet there's still flooding in Bismarck, and so storage alone isn't the answer. You have to have storage plus government and management, because sometimes the dam can prevent a flood and sometimes it can create one. So that's another reason why it can't be the end-all approach. So we have to keep thinking about the governance models. Okay, thank you.
Thank you kindly. Any other comments? Seeing none, let's take lunch. Let's come back at 1:45, and we'll make up the 15 minutes into this afternoon.